Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing, at which we're going to hear evidence from the Commissioner.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, good morning. I now call the Commissioner, please.
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Good. Thank you very much, Commissioner. Yes, Mr. Tennant.
Commissioner, good morning. Can I ask you, please, to give the inquiry your full name?
Dany Cotton.
Thank you. Now, can I ask you, please, first to take your witness statement that you gave to the police on the 21st of February 2018, and it's MET 000124992. We have it there on the screen. You may also have it there in front of you in a paper form, but the way we've been working is to work from the screens either at the back of the room or the monitor on your desk. Now, there are a number of exhibits to that statement, and I'll just read them into the record if I may. We have DAC 1, which is your role profile for the position of Commissioner, and that's MET 000155759. DAC 2, which is a Google map of the area surrounding Grenfell Tower, which is MET 000155758. DAC 3, which are your handwritten notes of relevant aspects of the timeline, which is MET 000155756. DAC 4, a typed document entitled Timeline Grenfell House, MET 000155757. DAC 5, a typed document entitled Transcript of Decision Logging and Tactical Coordination Meeting Minutes for Incident Commander Andy Rowe, or what we've called the Rowe Log, which is MET 000155755. DAC 6, which is a printout of the calls you made from your mobile telephone on the night of June the 14th, or morning of June the 14th, 2017. MET 000155754, and finally DAC 7, a hard copy of the photograph you took on your mobile telephone at 2:51 a.m. on that morning at MET 000157660. Now, going back to your statement, Commissioner, have you read it recently?
I have, yes.
And can you confirm for us that its contents are true?
I can.
And have you discussed the evidence in that statement or that you're going to give to the inquiry today with anybody before coming here today?
No, I haven't.
Right. Now, if any question that I ask is unclear, I'm very happy to rephrase it or put the question in a slightly different way. Please don't hesitate to ask. And similarly, if you need any break at any time, please just say. We're going to work on the basis that we'll take hourly breaks.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman, if that's not inconvenient to you.
No, I think that's sensible. Thank you.
Very good.
Thanks.
Now, can I start by asking you some very basic details about your career? Commissioner, you joined the LFB, I think, in April 1988.
I did, that's correct.
And you therefore thereafter progressed, as it were, up the ranks.
Yes, I have.
Yes. And in 2007, I think you were promoted to Area Commander.
I was, yes, that's correct.
And in 2010, promoted to the rank of DAC, Deputy Assistant Commissioner.
That's right, yes.
And in 2012, you were promoted to the rank of Assistant Commissioner, or AC.
That's correct.
And in the rank of Assistant Commissioner, is it right that you were first Assistant Commissioner in charge of Operational Assurance?
I was, yes.
What did that role involve?
So that was a new role that was established to combine a number of teams together to look at providing, the term operational assurance. So the team was comprising the Health and Safety Department that previously had been a standalone department, but combining it with the ORT team that I think you're familiar with. So using those two roles together, so not only did we have the operational assurance on the fire ground, but then the health and safety team that used to do the investigations where things had potentially gone wrong, where we'd had accidents, near misses, or those kind of events, to bring those two teams together to be able to look in the whole at the sort of operational competence of firefighters, what happened on the fire ground, learning lessons through the health and safety investigation process, and wrapping that up as operational assurance.
Right. Had you any experience in H&S or ORT?
No, I hadn't. So what I had was a very good team of health and safety professionals with full health and safety qualifications that worked for me, and the operational response team run by a Deputy Assistant Commissioner. What my view was to be the overarching person who could look across the piece to both of those, not being the professional expert in either, but to bring the two together and combine that to be able to give some operational assurance to the organisation, especially around things to do with lessons learned.
I see, okay. So you say especially around things to do with lessons learned. So
Yeah.
would you say that you got sufficient or perhaps some degree of grounding in looking at an incident and knowing how to derive lessons learned from it?
Yeah, and what we also did was we took the lessons learned and things like Rule 43 actions from where other UK fire and rescue services had those as a result of events that, you know, where people have been injured or where firefighters had lost their lives. And we took those into London, and I used it to then be able to look at London Fire Brigade and assess us against those Rule 43s so that we could see whether or not effectively we would fall into any of the same areas, or whether or not we could be assured for ourselves that London Fire Brigade would stand up to be able to perform, you know, and not have those things go wrong effectively.
I see. And that was, of course, as you've said, after you were promoted to the rank of AC.
Yeah.
Can you give us the dates during which you occupied the role in charge of operational assurance?
Oh, crikey. So it was from the role, the time I got promoted as Assistant Commissioner.
2012.
Yes, until I got the Director's job, which was in 2016.
Right. And did your role in charge of operational assurance involve responsibility for training?
No, my next role as the Director. So when I became the Director of Operational Assurance, which was effectively a Deputy Commissioner post at that point, I was then in charge of training.
Right. Now, as you've just said, you became Director of Safety and Assurance, and that was in 2016.
Yes.
Can you tell us exactly when in 2016 you took on that role?
No, sorry, not off the top of my head.
Okay, was it before August or after August?
It would have been very early in 2016.
Okay.
So I think I did the role of Director for approximately a year, 18 months before I got promoted to Commissioner. And I became Commissioner at the beginning of 2017.
And could you tell us what the role of Director of Safety and Assurance involved?
Yes, so the Director of Safety and Assurance contained training, so being overall responsible for training for the health and safety, the ORT, for the Operational Policy Department. So effectively, London Fire Brigade is split into 3 directorates. One of them is the one that looks after fire stations, control and mobilising, and fire safety. One of them looks after effectively the non-operational functions, so things like procurement, transport, finance. And my department was the one that picked up the rest of the things that actually impact on the operational role, but weren't part of the frontline fire stations.
Right. And again, did your role as Director of Safety and Assurance involve responsibility for training?
It did, yes.
It did. And in that role, can you tell us in brief terms how you discharge your functions in relation to training?
Yes, so obviously we have an outsourced training contract to our training provider through Babcock. So my role is I had a head of training, so each one of my different areas of reference had a specific head in charge of that. So my role would be to ensure that he was doing his job and to sort of performance monitor and manage him in relation to the targets set out for training. We have some very specific areas that we at the time would report through to our board of members that we had at the time. So when we were London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority, so the authority members, there'd be certain things that would be my responsibility to report into meetings to them about performance against targets. And a lot of that was about ensuring that our training was developed in a way so that, as you can imagine, training is something that has to evolve all the time, especially in relation to the fire service, you know, new pieces of technology, new equipment, in relation to things like recommendations, and to make sure that our training could evolve. One of the things to understand, London Fire Brigade is quite a big beast, and to develop training packages and to assure that training for the large number of operational firefighters we have is quite a challenge at times.
Right. Arising out of that answer, did you have any responsibility for ensuring, or quality assuring, Babcock's delivery of training?
Yes, so not directly personally because I was overseeing it, but through my head of training.
Who was that?
Peter Groves.
Peter?
Peter Groves.
Groves. Peter Groves, right. And how did you personally oversee his management of quality assuring Babcock's performance of their obligations to deliver training?
So I would meet with him regularly as a one-to-one, performance management meetings I had with all my heads of service, and through that I would ask him questions. We would look at statistics for the people who'd been trained, the people who required training, where we could see areas if people, if we weren't up to maintaining numbers around specific skills or things like that. I would challenge him as to how we were going to make sure we addressed those shortfalls. So it'd be regular meetings, regular monitoring, and looking at statistics and data.
Right. Now, you were the interim commissioner, I think, as of 1st of January 2017.
I was.
And following the statutory reorganisation under the 2017 Police and Crime Act and the abolition of LFB, London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority, for want of a better word or set of words, you became the Fire Commissioner for London on the when exactly?
The meeting to ratify my position. Initially, I was the interim commissioner because it was going to be a very short time before the Police and Crime Bill was enacted. Unfortunately, due to some delays, it was far longer than thought. So the members of the Fire Authority decided they wanted to sort of cease that position and make me a permanent commissioner. And the meeting was scheduled and planned and actually took place on the 14th of June.
So you went from the fire to that meeting?
No, I wasn't required to be present. This was a meeting of the board of members who were making decisions about me. So no, I was still on the fire ground when the meeting took place.
Right. Okay. Now, can I turn to the role and principal functions that you had to discharge in your position as Commissioner? As Commissioner, in basic terms, is it right that you run the brigade?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. And on page 1 of your witness statement, you describe those in a little bit of detail. You can just look at the foot of that page. You say, basically, everything that goes on involving London Fire Brigade is my responsibility. I could explain in detail each role and core responsibility I have, but to assist, I've handed DC Watson a copy of my job description. You explain what those are. In summary, what are the basic areas for which you're responsible now, or were as at the 14th of June?
Everything that London Fire Brigade does to discharge its duties as a fire and rescue service.
Right.
So all functions that it's required to do, both lawfully and those which we do to keep members of the public safe. Everything from the fire safety functions through to ensure operational firefighters are competent, ensuring our money is spent in a wise way, accounting for our budgets, basically everything that London Fire Brigade does, I am overall responsible for. Right.
Let's look at a little bit more detail with the benefit of a document. At DAC 1, which is MET 000-15759, Commissioner, we have a document entitled Commissioner for Fire and Emergency Planning Role Profile. And this is the document you handed to DC Watson and described as DAC 1. And we can see the organogram there. You sit above Deputy Commissioner for Fire and Emergency Planning, Operational Policy and Training, Director of Resources and Corporate Services. And then it says the main purpose of the job to provide strong, effective corporate leadership and strategic direction to ensure that the authority achieves its vision, aims and objectives. And the core responsibilities are then set out. Can I just turn specifically to page 2, which sits within that part of your core responsibilities. And it says only applicable to an operational role, to take command and manage major operational incidents as required. You see that?
I do, yes.
In your capacity as Commissioner, have you ever, or had you ever, had cause prior to the 14th of June 2017 to assume command at a major operational incident of the kind that you haven't? And what about before you were promoted to Commissioner?
No, so in the role I did when I was an Assistant Commissioner, I would have taken command, but from that role above, so the 3 operational roles above Assistant Commissioner are myself and now renamed my 2 Deputy Commissioners, and we predominantly go to the fireground in the role of Monitoring Officer. That role would give us the right to take over if we thought it was required, but I've never known a Principal Officer of my rank as a Monitoring Officer to have to take over. Right,
you've never known it?
No,
Have you ever known it? Have you ever known others do it?
Not to my knowledge, no. Someone might have done. I cannot recall anyone ever doing that.
Okay. Now, let's turn to training. And can I start with training on high-rise policy? Can I assume that as an operational firefighter in that part of your career, you personally received training in relation to high-rise firefighting?
Yes, I have.
And on incident command at a high-rise fire?
Yes, on many occasions.
Yes. Can you remember, what was the last training you received on incident operational firefighting before the Grenfell Tower fire?
So I haven't actually received training for a while because in the role I am in now, what I have done mainly is to undertake operational assessments of colleagues from assistant commissioner level rank, where I've been assessing their operational capability during high-rise scenarios, and some of those I've been involved in the specific design of those scenarios to ensure they incorporate all of the learning that we wish to see that people, you know, demonstrate in an operational context. So
Right.
I can't recall the last time I specifically had training.
Right. Does that tell us that it was quite a long time before the Grenfell Tower fire?
Yes, I would say so.
Okay. Now, just on the last answer, there's a point of detail I want to just follow up. You say that you've mainly undertaken operational assessments of colleagues from AC level, where you assess their operational capability during high-rise scenarios. Did you ever receive any training on how to go about conducting or designing those assessments or scenarios?
Not direct training, you could sort of correlate to training, but working with professional colleagues who have been doing that job for a number of years, working alongside it to quality assure each other's operational assessments. I've received sort of the role of doing that, but not something you would say is a training package that you could you know, then demonstrate you've done, but more peer support and peer assessment, as it were.
I see. And when was the last time prior to the Grenfell Tower fire that you conducted an operational assessment of an assistant commissioner?
I would suggest within the previous 12 months.
Right. Do you know who it was?
Oh, you can also, I think I did the operational assessment for a range of assistant commissioners. There were probably internal and external candidates applying for the assistant commissioner role. I can't remember specifically who I did because I've done a number of assessments since.
Right. Now, we may need to come back to that in due course. Can I just continue with this then? Overall, as an incident commander, what experience have you had of a large-scale fire in a high-rise residential block?
So I've been to a number of high-rise fires and residential blocks. The last one that I probably attended that involved a loss of life was a 10-pump fire in Silvertown, which was when I was I think a deputy assistant commissioner, so probably about 8 years ago. Which was tragically lost 2 lives, but it was an arson-related fire.
Right. And did that involve multiple breach of compartmentation?
No, it didn't.
Okay. And I think you were involved in work after Lacknell House to improve incident command, is what you say in your statement at page 2. And does that also include lessons learned for incident commanders?
It does, yes.
You just described the Silvertown fire, and you were there in your role as a DAC.
Yeah.
Was there a large high-rise fire that you attended in your role as monitoring officer?
Not for some considerable years. I will have been to I've been to a number of large high-rise fires, but not in the role, probably not for about 5 or 6 years, if not longer.
Right.
Not one I can recall.
And what rank does that mean that you were in the rank of assistant commissioner, monitoring a group manager as incident commander?
Assistant commissioners monitor deputy assistant
Sorry,
commissioners.
deputy assistant commissioner.
Yes.
Right, I see. Okay. And what was that fire?
I can't recall where it was off the top of my head. It didn't involve loss of life or breach of compartmentation. It was just a large number of resources because the fire was on a high floor.
Right.
And it was very visual, which tends to, we encourage our incident commanders to ask resources early, and I think it was a fire that was very visual from a lot of distance, but it didn't actually breach any compartment. It was extinguished quite quickly.
Have you ever had training on how to carry out the role of monitoring officer at a high-rise incident?
Not specifically a high-rise incident. We give our incident commanders training in how to perform the role of monitoring officer. We don't make it specific to incidents because the role of monitoring officer is a generic role that you should be able to transfer to any operational incident. So we train people for the role, not for the specifics.
Have you ever experienced in any role, at any rank in your career, widespread compartmentation failure in a high-rise residential block?
No, not personally.
Right. In terms of your personal experience of firefighting at a high-rise residential block, did you ever receive training on how to spot and handle fire spread over the facade of a high-rise residential block?
No, not on a high-rise residential block. I've only ever received training for looking at fire spread in things like sandwich panels, but not in a residential block, no.
Okay. Does it follow from that that you've never received any training on cladding and fire spread up, round or down cladding?
No, not to do cladding.
Does it also follow that therefore you've never received training on the particular dangers that cladding poses?
No.
Or how to respond?
No, I haven't.
Now, I want to ask you one or two questions about what has become known as stay put. Can I ask you to look, please, at page 37 of your witness statement? You've set out at the bottom of that page a heading, the stay put advice. And you say, this is part of our advice and guidance about keeping safe in the event of a fire in a high-rise building. Stay put is just the specific bit of advice that we can relay to people in the event of a fire in a property. It's not predominantly around high-rise, as it depends on where a fire happens and where you are in relation to it. We make a decision about whether or not you're going to be safer if you remain in your property, or whether it's safer for you to try and leave your property. Now, I've got a number of questions about what you say there. The first is this. Is stay put not simply normal standing advice to all residents in a high-rise residential block, rather than what a control room officer specifically says to a caller?
Yes, so this isn't particularly well articulated, I have to confess, the answer here, and it was in relation to a specific question that was put to me by the police officer who was interviewing me, and it was more specific around fast survival guidance and stay put. But what has got transcribed is just says the stay put advice, which sounds a little curious, but it was in relation to a question around that. So stay put is the extant policy for high rise, for all residents in high rise. It's the absolutely correct policy because that is how a building should behave. The whole purpose of stay put is that what we would not seek to have at a fire in a high rise is for all of the residents to self-evacuate when they don't need to. You know, we see in that there's the risk of us not being able to get into the building. And the whole purpose of a compartmentation of a building is that it should stay contained for 60 minutes to give us, as professional firefighters, the opportunity to extinguish that fire within that time. So stay put is the generic advice for high-rise buildings and is standing advice. It's standing advice, so it's more to do with the building than specific advice given by the brigade to a caller. Right. Now, when a caller calls, just pursuing that a bit further, when a caller calls, that's normally, isn't it, because they are affected by heat, smoke or fire in their flat and they need advice as to whether they can safely leave? Not necessarily. Sometimes what happens is if you're in a high-rise building and there's a fire within that building, you might see the products of that fire travelling past your window. So you might not actually be affected by it. Some people will naturally phone if you are in your flat and you see smoke coming past your window. People will call us. So it's not necessarily the case that everyone who phones in relation to a fire is affected by that fire. They might just be concerned by what they can see out of their window, naturally. Okay, we'll come back to that then in a moment. When somebody calls and says they're trapped, then is this right? They get FSG advice and they're treated as an FSG, fire survival guidance caller, and are not advised to stay put. No. They've got no choice. No, if your compartment, so your flat or the room you're in, is affected by fire, smoke or any of those products, yes, absolutely, we won't advise you to stay put. That would be counterintuitive. So we have three categories, I think we've established. When would you actually, or when would a CRO actually give stay put advice to a caller? So if you were to phone and you were to express concern because they believe there to be a fire in your block of flats and you were a resident there, but the fire was not affecting you in any way, shape or form, so there's no heat, no smoke, anything travelling into your actual flat, we would advise you to stay in your flat because that's the safest place to be. Right. And by leaving, you may well hinder the emergency services response. And would that caller be given some kind of guidance or advice as to how to go about making the assessment as to whether it was safe to leave or not? Absolutely. If they said there was no risk to them, there was no smoke or anything in their flat, they will be told to remain in their flat. But if those circumstances change, they will be advised to call back. Right. We may come to callbacks
and vice versa later on today. But when would a CRO actually tell or advise a caller to stay put?
If there was no impact in their flat from any products of fire.
That would require, wouldn't it, a CRO, control room officer, to be able to make a reliable assessment of whether it was genuinely safe for the caller to stay in their flat, wouldn't it?
Yeah, so the control officer can't physically make that assessment, they're not on the scene, but the question they will ask of the person who is inside the flat and making that call will establish that. So if they say to the person, have you got any smoke in your flat? Is there any heat in your flat? Can you see flames in your flat? If the answer to all that is no, my flat is safe and I'm safe to be here, then that's when they would advise them to stay in their flat.
What would happen when the fire was very dynamic? So, although for the moment the caller thought it was, I was saying, there is no heat, smoke or fire in my flat, but the fire was developing very rapidly, what would the CRO then advise?
So the control officer wouldn't be aware the fire was developing rapidly and dynamic. They unfortunately, can't see into the building at that time. They can only rely on the information that is being passed to them by the caller. So, the advice will remain that if your flat is still unaffected, you are safest to stay there. However, if that situation changes, call us back.
Does that not put quite a lot of burden onto the caller to make an assessment for themselves?
But equally, if they were to be in a situation where the control officer were to say to them, leave your flat now, and there was nothing wrong with where they were, and the control officer could then be putting them in a position of danger where they were going into a stairwell that may be affected, or by them leaving their flat, it may well put them at risk because they're going to try and hurry out of the building when there's no need to do so, might cause slips, trips or falls, or prevent us coming in and doing our job.
Yes, and I asked you a question, you've said equally, so you've put the other side of the equation. So there is an equation, isn't there, between two things, just see if this is right. One, the risk of leaving the caller in a flat which might become affected by smoke or fire or heat, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the risks inherent in putting them out into a potentially smoke-logged exit route. That's the balance, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's a balance, but I think we need to take that in the context of buildings are designed for the fire to stay within the compartment of origin for 60 minutes, and for the vast majority of those, they do that. Therefore, the balance is that it's much safer for you to remain in your flat and to not open doors and become compromised by what's going on outside. And our experience as professional firefighters tells us that in the vast, vast majority of cases that happens. So that balance for us is about the callers giving us information, they are telling us what they can see and what's real to them at that moment in time. We as professional firefighters, as professional control officers, are making that judgment for them to make them the safest, keep them as safe as possible. And if the building behaves correctly and it does not go beyond the compartment of origin and we extinguish the fire, that's the safest option for them.
Yes. Now, in that answer, there's try and put it as a question if I can, rather than a statement to you, but is it right that in what you've just said there is a degree at least of assumption? You said if the building behaves correctly, but what if the building doesn't behave correctly?
Well, in that case, we have to rely on the information we are receiving that the control officer is being given by the person in the building. Unfortunately, what we don't seek to do is to assume that every single building will fail, because that would be catastrophic. And if we were to make work on that assumption the whole time, it would make our jobs untenable, because you would just be constantly telling everyone to get out of a building that isn't suitable for the purposes of evacuating. And my concern then would be that if people were self-evacuating down a single staircase building, that what we would end up with is a significant number of crush injuries, and then you'd also get people who found it harder to evacuate, who were being stranded and in distress.
Does it follow from that the stay put advice, encapsulating all three elements which we've discussed, proceeds on the assumption that there will not be a whole block fire or mass breach of compartmentation in a high-rise block? How reliable is that assumption?
The vast majority of the time, it's a very reliable assumption, and we have to believe that the correct procedures have taken place in the design of a building, in the refurbishment of a building, construction of it, and the products using it. We have to rely on the fact that that's what the people doing their jobs do, and that we come as professional firefighters to a compartment that will remain contained for 60 minutes and extinguish a fire.
As at the night of the 14th of June, to your knowledge, were there any doubts in the brigade about the reliability of that assumption?
No, because we'd never experienced an event like that. We've never seen such a significant failure of a building.
Can I ask you, before I leave this topic and pick up on that last answer, a slightly side question. Do control room operators or incident commanders have any training on how to go about balancing the risk of leaving the caller in a flat which might become compromised by smoke, heat or fire, on the one hand, with, on the other, the dangers of putting them into a compromised exit route?
So the training they receive is about the questions they ask, the answers they receive, and making that balanced judgment as professional officers at that moment in time. What we wouldn't seek for them to do is to try and undertake a risk assessment of every building where there's a fire, because obviously the control officer doesn't have the advantage of being able to see into that building and understand what's going on at that moment in time.
Are there any scenarios you're aware of where control room officers or incident commanders were ever faced with having to make that decision in circumstances where the fire was very dynamic and they didn't know whether or not the flat from which the caller was calling would remain safe?
So, not specific to my knowledge. Obviously, we have the experience we had of the Lacknell house fire, where we had the experience and what happened there and the lessons we learned from that. But I don't know, and I've never been on an operational incident where fire survival guidance has been taking place before the night of the 14th of June. I have never, in the multiple operational incidents I've attended, I've never been to an incident with fire survival guidance. It's not a terribly common event.
Okay. Can I just ask you, and we'll pick up this thread in a moment, but can I just ask you to go to page 35, please, Commissioner, of your statement. In the second paragraph, you say, also the smoke should never have gone into the communal parts of the building. Now, I think, to be fair to you, this is in a section of your statement which starts on page 34, which is entitled "The Building and Factors That Impeded Our Firefighting and Rescue Efforts." Mm-hmm. So it sits within that section, and you've covered other things like wet rising and dry rising mains. And here you're dealing with the leaking of smoke into communal parts of the building. So that's the context.
Yeah.
And you say, 5 lines down, buildings are supposed to have doors that then stop that smoke from travelling upstairs. There should be a door from the stairwell, and the flats themselves will have front doors, so there should be sufficient barriers to stop fire and smoke spreading. Once there is thick black smoke in a communal stairwell, people will not go out and into that stairwell to come down. In fact, British buildings are not designed for people to evacuate because they're designed for the fire to stay in the compartment, for us to go in and put the fire out. Now, I'm interested in smoke leaking out into the stairwell, just focusing on that. Are you aware, and I'm assuming you are aware, but are you aware of the practice of high-rise firefighting whereby crews set in hoses into dry-rising main outlets on the floor below the fire floor?
I am.
And are you aware that that would require the door to be propped open so that the smoke, in order to let the hoses go up the stairs and into the fire floor?
Yes, that's
and
correct.
that creates the risk that the smoke will escape into the stairwell?
Yes, it does.
What training have you received on the need to minimise the smoke leakage in that way to preserve the escape route?
So that's part of the high-rise training scenarios that we practice, conversations around, because the reason we do that and we set in 2 floors below is that it gives the opportunity for the firefighters to start their breathing apparatus up in fresh air, which is vitally important. It also gives the opportunity for the hose to be in a protected place and for us to be able to set bridgeheads up in a safe environment. That's why that happens. If we set it up on the floor of the fire of origin itself, then we can't do those safety factors. But it is a balanced risk about how much you let smoke in. But the risk is that you want to get in there and put the fire out as quickly as possible, following our safety procedures.
Right. Well, my next question was, is it a safe practice? And is it?
Yeah. Yes, it is.
And have you ever had any difficulties with evacuating residents down a single stairwell where the doors have been propped open by hoses from lower floors?
I've never evacuated residents down a single stairwell because we've never had a need to do so.
Okay. Now then, coming to the next issue, which follows from 1 or 2 of your answers earlier, I want to look at the knowledge in the LFB of risks posed by cladding. Now, you say in your statement on page 2, and it's the second paragraph, halfway down the paragraph, exactly halfway down the page, you say, had I set up the fire at Grenfell Tower as an incident command scenario, people would have said that it was unrealistic because it would never happen. Now, I just want to look at that sentence with you. What elements of the Grenfell Tower fire do you say would never happen?
Complete failure of a building, the ability for a fire to spread across the external face of a building, the ability of that fire to then travel through the building, breach all the compartments, to travel across central communal parts and areas, for the fire to spread as rapidly as it did, for it to involve as many people, for it to involve as many fire survivor guidance calls. I could go on forever. The whole of the system of that night, of what happened to that building, would have been deemed to have been a completely unrealistic scenario that would never happen.
Before Grenfell, June 17, were you aware of a fire at Garnock Court in Scotland in 1999?
No, I wasn't.
Were you aware of the Parliamentary Select Committee's report into the risks posed by cladding following that fire?
No, I wasn't.
Were you aware of a fire at the Mermoz Tower in Roubaix in France in May 2012?
No, I wasn't.
Were you aware of the Tamwheel fire in Dubai in November 2012?
No.
Or the La Crosse building fire in Melbourne in Australia in November 2014?
I had heard of that one.
You'd heard of that one. What had you heard about that?
Just that it was a significant fire, but it was in a very different building that had more than one exit staircase and had internal firefighting suppression means that we don't have here. So it wasn't a comparable building to buildings in London.
Do you happen to know what the Australian legislative response to that fire has been?
No, sorry.
No, I didn't think you did. Do you know, maybe the answer is you don't, that each of those buildings involved cladding on high-rise buildings, which assisted external fire spread?
No, I didn't.
Can I ask you to look at a document in our policy bundle, which is GRA 3.2, and this is LFB 1255, and we have it in our policy bundle at tab 7. And I'll just put the front sheet on the screen for you. You should have it there, Commissioner. This is a document put out by the DCLG, Department for Communities and Local Government, dated February 2014, and the entitlement is GRA, Generic Risk Assessments 3.2, Fighting Fires in High-Rise Buildings. First question, are you familiar with this document?
I am, yes.
Were you familiar with this document as at the night of the Grenfell Tower fire?
I knew its existence. I wasn't familiar. It's not something that we use to develop or train any of our officers. It's something our policy department uses to develop internal London Fire Brigade policies. Therefore, I'm familiar with the London Fire Brigade high-rise policy, but not in detail, but I'm aware of the GRA.
Are you aware of its specific terms and contents?
No, because we use that to translate to London Fire Brigade policies, and that's what we train on.
Right, but the role of transferring the GRA into LFB specific policy would be something that would fall under your supervision, would it, or not?
Absolutely, but you couldn't possibly expect me to be aware of every single GRA and every single policy document that is contained within the contents of. Training to the London-specific ones, yes, but the GRAs themselves, that's why we have an operational policy department that can translate those into London Fire Brigade-specific documents.
That I understand, but do I take it that you're not personally familiar with the detailed contents of this document?
I have read it subsequently because it was obviously something that was going to be of interest, but previous to that, no.
All right. Well, let's see how we go. What I won't ask you is about language particularly necessarily, but about some of the principles in it. Can I ask you first, please, to turn to page 8 internally, page 10 in the relativity reference. I should ask you, first of all, I'm sorry, I should have done. Did you know that this document was produced, at least in part, as a response to the Lacknell House fire in 2009?
Yes, I was
You
aware
did?
of that, yes.
Okay. Page 10, under the title Construction Technique. Now, this sits within a part of the GRA entitled Significant Hazards and Risks, which is on the page before, and the sub-part is Building Height, Layout and Design. And under this, it says construction technique. Any building under construction may provide additional hazards. And then the next paragraph, combustible material in voids and cavities and poor quality construction can also contribute to the spread of fire and smoke beyond the compartment of origin. Now, standing away from the specific language, as a principle, as at the night of the Grenfell Tower fire, were you aware of that as a general principle?
The principle of the fact that combustible materials in voids and cavities could spread fires, absolutely, because that's something that we train our officers to look for, and it's one of the reasons we have thermal imaging cameras to be able to detect fire spread through voids.
Yes. Now, focusing on poor quality construction, is that also something that you train your officers to look for?
Unfortunately, firefighters are not fire engineers, and therefore we would be unable to make an assessment whether a building was of poor quality construction. We have no reference point to understand what poor quality construction would look like and mean, and if I were to look at a building now covered in cladding, I wouldn't be able to make an assessment as to whether or not it was constructed poorly. Not least of all because part of that is about how something's applied to a building. So if you apply cladding incorrectly and leave a large void behind it, once the cladding's applied, there is no way of seeing behind there.
Does that mean that poor quality construction, although a significant risk relevant to fire spread in a high-rise block, was something on which you didn't and couldn't train officers?
It would be impossible to train officers to be able to recognise poor quality construction, not least of all because as senior and principal fire officers, we would expect a building to have been through several stages of building control and inspection before we come to interact with it in the situation in a fire, and we would expect that to be addressed at those stages. And I would suggest it would be terribly difficult to try and train people to recognise all the potential pitfalls of poor quality construction.
So do you know what perhaps you don't know, but what's the point of mentioning poor quality construction in a document such as this?
No, to be fair, it's a kind. I could see why people would want to state that, but without then expressing how you would mitigate that risk, it's quite a bland statement, really.
Right. Well, let me just pursue that a bit more. If you go to page 16 internally, page 18 of the document, I'm taking you to a long page with no real guidance in it as to what it's about. This, and what I want to show you, starts at the top about familiarisation visits, and it sits within the section of this document under key control measures, and the subheading is planning, and that starts two pages before, and I'm happy to show you any of that if you want to, but my specific questions are on page 16 or 18. Mm-hmm. Information to be gathered in relation to high-rise incidents should include, and there's a long shopping list there, and I just want to ask you to look at the fourth one from the bottom. There are plenty of others we could spend time looking at, but I want to focus on that if I can. Mm-hmm. Building construction features, such as the presence and location of maisonette-style construction, sandwich panels, timber framing, cladding systems, surface-mounted trunking, ducting and voids, in addition to features which present a specific hazard such as asbestos. Now, as at the night of the Grenfell Tower fire, were you aware that information to be gathered by those responsible for gathering that information should include building construction features, including cladding systems, at the national level?
No, I would expect building construction to be the subject of something that you gather information on, but not specifics around cladding, no.
Right. And do you know whether there was any training that you ever saw or were responsible for that would enable your brigade's officers to gather information relating to high-rise incidents about building construction features?
No, so we would, on our inspections, we would look at certain features of a building. For instance, the presence of sandwich panels in large-scale industrial buildings, because we know the risks to firefighters posed by those. Sadly, firefighters have lost their lives due to those. In fact, the first woman firefighter to died as a result of a sandwich panel fire. So we'd look at those, but we wouldn't expect to give people training to understand looking at a cladding system to see whether or not that was a risk, because it would be almost impossible to look at a building and ascertain whether or not the external parts of a building. So, for instance, if you were to look at a building that had balconies, that had wooden decking on those balconies, you would recognise that's a potential risk, because we regularly have fires involving barbecues on balconies that then spread up through the wooden decking, or now the living wall features. I'm not sure if you're familiar with those, where people plant living walls and they are very flammable. We've had some significant, very visual fires on external parts of a building involving those. But, you know, looking at a building and seeing it's clad wouldn't equate to risk in the eyes of a normal firefighter.
It sounds from that last answer as if people, this is a very general question, I think in response to quite a general answer, but it sounds as if people go around collecting information, looking at risks on the basis of their own experience of past fires, rather than looking at the wording of a particular policy. Is that right?
It's a balance of both. As professional officers, you will always use your own professional experience and take that into consideration. We would expect that on every occasion. But bearing in mind that we have a range of experience across our officers, then they would look at guidance from documents as well. But what I'm suggesting is that it would be really difficult to have a look at any building and look at cladding and perceive it to be a risk, because it shouldn't be.
Now, just in case I'm accused of being unfair and putting to you a document you have said you're not familiar with, can I assume you're familiar with LFB policy 633, high-rise firefighting?
I am.
Yeah, and Appendix 1, in particular 72D.
Yes, I am.
And we'll come back to this later on, but I just want to pursue this now. Can I ask you to be shown that, please? It's tab 4 of our policy bundle. Floor layout, Appendix 1, which is on page 19 internally. And I'm going to assume you're familiar with this text,
yes.
but I'll just read it out because other people may not be. During 72D visits, personnel should ensure that they are familiar with the following and their impact on firefighting, search and rescue operations. And then if you look down this long list, you see about halfway down, floor layouts and any building construction features which may promote rapid or abnormal fire spread. And then there are some examples given. Now, looking at the general, what training do you know officers had to go out on 72D visits and ensure familiarity with building construction features which may promote rapid or abnormal fire spread?
I don't think we've given people specific training around that. I think that would be very much around looking at building and experience, and it will be around conversations around 72D, but we don't give specific training around that area.
Right. Can you help me with a question? We see there, such as sandwich panels, timber frame construction, atria or voids. It may or may not have escaped your attention that the word cladding is not there. Do you know why?
Because I would think at the time the document was drafted, cladding wasn't perceived to be a risk.
Right. Okay, let's pursue that a bit. Can I start in pursuit of that by asking Paul to turn up, please, the LFIPA briefing note. Sorry, it's LFB LFB quintuple 0207. Now, there it is, and this is the note prepared for a Lacknell House working group meeting on the 31st of March 2014. Mm-hmm. And I don't know whether this is something you were present at.
No, it wasn't.
Do you know you weren't?
I know from the likelihood of the meeting it went to that I wouldn't have been at that level at that time to have been invited to that meeting.
Oh, I see. Okay. And you say why? Because it was above your level or below your level?
Yes, it would have been, yes. So it would have been specific. So the information, it says there was a report by the Director for Operational Resilience and Training and the Assistant Commissioner for Fire Safety Regulation. I was neither of those people, and in general, that is a meeting of our members, so there wouldn't be other people involved in that. I see.
At any time after you took over responsibility for fire safety or became Commissioner, did you ever see this agenda? It is just an agenda there, or any document relating to it as part of your familiarisation or briefing with your role?
No, not to my knowledge.
Okay, well, let's see how we go with it. If you turn to page 8 internally, please. You can see that there is a title at the top, High-Rise Risk Assessment and Operational Procedure Review. You see that? Mm-hmm. And if you look at the second paragraph on that page, it refers to the revised GRA published in February 2014. That's what we've just looked at, or one of the things we've just looked at, Commissioner. And incorporates all the lessons learned from the Lacknell incident as outlined by the coroner, as well as the wider issues covered by the investigation. The revised GRA incorporates newly identified hazards to firefighters and the public that were exemplified by the Lacknell incident. These, and this is the important sentence I just want you to focus on, these include the potential for the rapid failure of lightweight UPVC wall panels and for fires to spread laterally and vertically in a downwards direction, hazards which are not unique to the Lacknell incident, but which are relatively rare and had not previously been recorded in the current version of the GRA, or rather relevant national guidance. Now, my question is, did you know when the GRA was published that was its purpose?
No.
Right. Had you received any training in any of the roles that you occupied after March 2014 and before the Grenfell fire relating to the risk of lateral and vertical fire spread?
Yes, I have.
Right. What training was that?
That's in relation to the Lacknell House training package we did, which was specific to the fact the UPVC wall and window panels failed significantly during the Lacknell House fire, and there was fire spread laterally during that incident. And the risks to firefighters posed by that, because there were complete breaches in walls, so the firefighters could have been at risk of actually stepping out and falling from the building. So we had specific training around that, yes.
You did. Now, can I then take you to page 33 of your statement? Where you deal in the second paragraph from the bottom, and again this is under the heading two paragraphs above, my knowledge of the initial fire and our response to it. Mm-hmm. And you go on to say in the first line of that paragraph, it was a, sorry, the next paragraph, it was a very severely developing fire in that it was consuming the outside of the building. It would have been very difficult for any fire officer standing on the incident ground to have understood what was happening to the building, because buildings don't behave like that, and we never see that type of fire spread. Mm-hmm. And then you go on to say, a couple of lines on from that, there's a building in Dubai called The Torch, which is a huge high-rise building, and it's caught fire twice in the last 3 years. But even though the fire went up the external part of the building, it actually went out within about 2 hours without ever impinging into the building. Are you referring there to the first fire at the Torch building, which was February 2015, or the second one in August 2017?
The second one in August 2017, I actually spoke to somebody who was in Dubai at the time and witnessed the fire and the firefighting activities, which was the 2-hour part. And they said it was amazing. It was extinguished, done and dusted, and the crews had gone within 2 hours, which was quite incredible.
But that's after Grenfell? That's
yes.
August 17. So,
yes.
Are you referring here then, just to be clear, to the first of those?
So I was aware there'd been a previous one. I don't know the details of the previous building, but I knew there had been a fire there which had not impinged on the internal parts of the building in that significant manner that Grenfell did.
And was that awareness something in your head when you attended the Grenfell incident on the night?
It was an awareness, yes, but it didn't equate in any way to what presented itself to me on that night. So I wasn't thinking in terms of that fire at all.
Right. So you didn't take any comfort, did you then, from the fact of failure of re-entry at the Dubai fire?
No.
Right. What detail did you know about that building?
Which building, sorry?
The Dubai building that caught
None
fire.
at all.
No. Can you help me whether, prior to Grenfell, there was, as it were, an institutional assumption within the LFB that on the basis of the experience of these other fires abroad, and I know you've said you don't know about them, that these fires on cladding pose no risk of re-entry?
I couldn't make the institutional assumption about that because I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of the operational workforce weren't specifically aware of those fires in other countries.
Right. So you weren't even in a position to make an assumption?
I wouldn't seek to make an assumption, no.
But you weren't even in a position to make an assumption because you didn't even know about those fires. Is that fair?
Well, no, I knew about some of them, but I wouldn't say other people did. So when you say institutional, you're making a comment about the whole organisation, yes. So I wouldn't be able to make that comment because I don't know what other people's level of awareness was.
All right. Were you aware of the Shepherd's Court fire on the 19th of August 2016?
I was aware of that, yes.
Did you attend?
I didn't.
Were you aware of what lessons were learnt from that fire?
Yes.
And what, in brief, can you tell us in brief, were those lessons?
Well, about fire spread and dealing with the fire of those situations, but I wasn't involved in the fire or investigation of it.
Can I ask you please to be shown a document, LFB 0003521? Now this is a slideshow produced by the LFB called Tall Building Facades, and although it bears the date of the 13th of July 2016, it's clear from the contents of this document that it's about the lessons to be learnt from the Shepherd's Court fire, and therefore it postdates that fire. And we've been told that it was ultimately finalised in October 2016. I'm not entirely sure when exactly in that month, but that's what we've been told. My first question is, did you see this slideshow at the time it was produced?
No.
You didn't? Now, in October 2016, I think you were still Director of Safety and Assurance, were you?
Yes, I was.
Right. Would it follow that you don't know who prepared this presentation?
I believe I know now it was in relation to fire safety and specifically fire engineering department, so a very specialised detailed department of fire engineers looking at those, and it wasn't a presentation that was given for wider circulation.
Well, you've answered a number of my following questions. Do you know to whom within the LFB that presentation was shown?
I believe only to fire engineers.
Okay. Do you know, you say only to fire engineers, how many is that?
I have no idea.
Well, let me just show you a document, if I may, before the break. LFB 0004014. Now, this is the first of, I think, a two-page document representing the circulation list of those invited to attend a presentation of this slideshow. Just running your eye down those names, can you tell us, in general terms, who they are and what they do?
They're my senior fire safety officers.
They're all senior fire safety officers,
They are.
right. And do you know, and I suspect the answer is no, do you know whether this slideshow was actually presented to them?
I have no idea.
Do you know who would know the answer to that question?
I suspect that Dan Daly or someone in the fire safety regulation team would be able to provide that information.
Okay. Can I show you, well, let me ask you this. Have you studied this document since Grenfell?
The tall building?
Yes.
I've looked through it, yes. I've not studied it in detail. I have looked through it.
Right. Who asked you to do that? Do you know?
Once you'd shown it here in the inquiry, my natural curiosity led me to go and have a look at it.
Yes, no, well, I thought that might be the case. Did you then look at the general conclusions, page 25?
I did.
Can we just look at those, please? I don't want to read them all out to you. They speak for themselves. My question is, does the fact of this presentation and these conclusions show that there was an emerging consciousness in or by October 2016 within the brigade that facades of high-rise buildings created unknown or difficult risks of fire spread?
I would say that would demonstrate that. What I would say is, as a professional organisation, London Fire Brigade will look at any emerging threat or risk to the people of London, and we will therefore do further work. So quite clearly last year, one of the things that we did the most work around was terrorism because of the emerging threat to terror. So we'll have specialist departments that will compile information and presentations in relation to specialist areas of risks. I would suggest that the fire engineering department, quite rightly in relation to looking at those buildings, put some information together to share with fire safety, senior fire safety officers. I would think that's absolutely right and proper that, you know, my professional teams will be looking at potential risks across the piece in a wide range of areas.
Do you know whether further work was done on this presentation between October 2016 and June 2017?
I have no idea.
You have no
Sorry.
idea. And again, who would know? Is that Dan Daly again?
Dan Daly in the fire safety
Right.
regulation team.
Okay. If, as seems from what you've told us, that this presentation was only seen by an audience of specialist fire safety engineers. Do you know how knowledge of the risks we see on this page of this presentation involving cladding on high-rise buildings would be communicated to the brigade's frontline operational firefighters?
I don't think it has been, because I wasn't familiar with this document beforehand. But the normal procedure would be, if there was deemed to be something that was a risk that needs to be shared, it would be developed into a training package that could then be shared more widely. Obviously, if that list was the people that were invited to attend, they're the senior fire safety officers who attend operational incidents in their capacity as a fire safety officer to assist with all kinds of measures of a building in relation to fire safety.
Do you know why this wasn't rolled out into a training package so that watch managers, who would be the first incident commanders at the scene, had not seen it and been trained on it?
No, I don't.
Can you explain why this presentation was kept to a limited coterie of LFB specialists so that even you didn't see it, Commissioner?
No, I have no idea.
Does that not indicate to you a structural or cultural failure within the brigade whereby complex science of fire safety was not made simple and disseminated widely?
No, I don't think it does. I think it indicates that the people who were looking at that were quite rightly responding to some incidents that had happened, but you have to base that against the fact that nobody would expect an incident like Grenfell, where the building would fail so spectacularly and be covered in such a highly flammable product, would be allowed to exist.
We've been told by senior officers, I think as late as this week, that an operational firefighter would always expect the unexpected. Was this not the unexpected which you should be expecting?
I don't think that's a reasonable thing to say. We do expect the unexpected. We respond to what we find in front of us. You know, at the beginning of last year, you wouldn't have expected the attacks to have happened in London. We responded and developed and trained from those. We learned from every operational incident. But in the same manner that I wouldn't develop a training package for a space shuttle to land on the Shard, you know, we would respond to it and deal with it in the same professional manner we do. That is an incident of that scale. So I wouldn't expect us to be developing training or response to something that simply shouldn't happen.
My question, and really it's a point, is space shuttles on the Shard or otherwise, this slideshow demonstrated to at least a narrow band of experts, specialists within the London Fire Brigade, that this was not such a risk that it could simply be treated as negligible. Is that fair?
It's not a negligible risk, but equally, I think even if you had given the information to Mike Dowden or any other first incident commanders that there was the potential for fire spreading outside the building, it would have made no difference to what happened on the night, because there wasn't the facility to be able to extinguish such severely developing and rapidly spreading fire, because it spread behind the cladding and there was no way of putting it out. So even if they'd known what they were and they'd had this training, they would have just seen what unfolded in front of them and still responded in the same way to the incident in front of them. So I understand your point that training is very important, but what we do is train our officers to respond to every single circumstance they come across on the fire ground. But providing training and awareness and knowledge doesn't mean you're able to resolve an incident that should never happen.
I'm really just seeking to see whether you're prepared to accept the proposition that when you say it should never happen, nonetheless, this risk was on LFB's radar 9 months before the Grenfell Tower fire. Do you accept that?
As with a number of other risks, yeah, except that people were aware of that.
Right. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it is. Well, Commissioner, we'll have a short break now for everyone's benefit. I have to ask you please not to talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room, and we'll resume at 11:15, please.
Thanks, sir.
$11:15 then, please. Oh, we'll just move that out of the way. Yes. You're right, ready to carry on?
Yes, I am, sir.
All right, thanks so much. Yes,
Commissioner, thank you for coming back to us. Can I now ask you please to be shown a letter, and it's at LFB quadruple 6085. This is a letter dated the 6th of April 2017, so only 2 or so months before the Grenfell Tower fire, to Mrs. Laura Johnson, Director of Housing at Kensington. Dear Mrs. Johnson, tall buildings, external fire spread. And just looking at that and looking at the shape of the document, are you familiar with this?
No, sorry, I'm not.
You've never seen it before?
No, I haven't, sorry.
Right. It comes from Dan Daly, as one can see from the second page, Assistant Commissioner Fire Safety Regulation. And if you haven't seen it before, there are only certain questions I can ask on it. But let me see where we go. First paragraph. The fire spread at Shepherd's Court in Hammersmith on the 19th of August 2016 received widespread coverage in the media, in the main because the cause of the fire was due to a faulty appliance that was subject to a product recall, an issue which the London Fire Brigade has been campaigning on. However, I am also drawing this fire to your attention to highlight the external spread of the fire that occurred. And then in the third paragraph, he says, we've seen a number of cases where it appears on the basis of the information available to us that the level of fire protection to the external face of the building did not comply with the requirements of Part B of the building regulations, so far as they seek to limit the speed with which a fire can travel and spread over the external face of a building or may contribute to a fire. And then in the next paragraph, he discusses Shepherd's Court and says in the second sentence, on testing it was found that panels may deform or delaminate, exposing any combustible core or constituent material, resulting in the panel becoming involved in the fire and allowing the fire to spread and enter flats other than the flat of origin. And then in the last paragraph, he says, I would therefore strongly urge that you, that's the council, consider this issue as part of the risk assessment process for premises under your control. I suggest that you make sure all relevant information about any replacement window and facade schemes is fully available to fire risk assessors. Where no reliable information is available for a given property, it is our general expectation that a strategy to assess the risk and, where necessary, implement short, medium and long-term actions to address the risk. This assessment will need to take...
Mr. Miller, just a moment. I'm not sure we've actually had the relevant passage
I think we need to go down
expanded.
It's the last paragraph. I'm so sorry. It's the last paragraph, Commissioner. I would therefore strongly urge you to consider this issue as part of the risk assessment.
Right. Commissioner, just cast your eye over it. Now you can read it.
Sorry, sir, it's still not in front of me.
It's still not on the screen, I'm afraid. It's the very last
paragraph.
Quite right. I'm sorry, Commissioner. We've got a... if we can look at the last paragraph on the second page. That is the last paragraph of the whole letter.
Thank you.
There. If you just cast your eye over that, I would therefore strongly urge that you consider this issue as part of the risk assessment process for premises under your control. I suggest that you make sure that all relevant information about any replacement window and facade schemes is fully available to fire risk assessors. Where no reliable information is available for a given property, it is our general expectation that a strategy to assess the risk and, where necessary, implement short, medium and long-term actions to address the risk, and there's a verb missing. This assessment will need to take account of other fire safety measures already in place in the building, as well as potential mitigation measures to ensure that any potential fire spread does not pose a risk to health and safety. Now, you told us you didn't see that letter, but my question then is, for the purposes of training, do you know what plans the LFB had in place to ensure that firefighters at all levels understood the risk identified in this letter?
No, I don't. I'm sorry. I don't think we would have trained our firefighters in specifically in relation to this risk, because this was obviously talking about people in local authorities assessing the buildings in their possession. So firefighters all received a training package from the Lacanau fire, both right from people on watches as well as officers, around the risks of external fire spread. But I'm not aware of any training we did in specific relation to this letter, no.
Right. Does that not indicate to you that an important risk around high-rise residential blocks was not being briefed to operational firefighters on the front line in your brigade?
No, I don't think that's the case, because I think this is the same as Lacknell House. It's external fire spread unpredicted, which was a training package that was developed. So although Shepherd's Court was a different fire, they still faced the same hazards effectively of failing panels, the risk of those falling, the risk of fire spreading. So this isn't a case of that. What we wouldn't seek to do, it would be very difficult that every single time there was a different fire, we'd develop another training package for that, because this is about the risk of external fire spread, which was covered in that training package.
Again, Commissioner, doesn't this letter demonstrate that at least by April 2017, only 2 months or so before the fire, the risk of external fire spread as a result of exteriors being composed of combustible core or constituent material was well on the brigade's radar?
Yeah, very clearly it was on the brigade's radar, and we were asking local authorities to support us by checking the buildings they had in their possession and checking the fire safety prevention measures and the mitigation in place, because obviously it's the responsibility of the responsible people in the local authorities to ensure those buildings are safe and fit for purpose for the residents, and also for us to be able to respond in the event of a fire, which is very key, because we always respond with an expectation of a building, how a building is going to behave. So I would say absolutely it's on our radar. But the risk from that external fire spread was never something calculated to be on the scale of Grenfell and the extremities of that.
We'll come to scale shortly, but just in terms of the nature, the type, the kind of this risk, can you tell me why frontline firefighters were not aware of this risk in this way at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire?
Sorry. What I wouldn't say is they weren't aware. I would say that there'd been understanding from things like Shepherd's Court and from Lacknell. That was a possibility. The question I think you asked me originally was whether they'd had specific training around that, which they had not had, as I understand it.
And the question is why, given that this risk was on the brigade's radar by as late as April 2017, why frontline firefighters had not had operational training on how to assess and deal with the risk that this letter talks about?
So I can answer that in two parts, if that would help. So the first part about being able to assess that risk, firefighters, senior officers, myself would not be able to assess that risk. So once again, I go back to the point that I couldn't look at a building now with external cladding on it and assess whether or not that was combustible, because we don't have the ability to be able to do that. It's subject to obviously a flame and a panel test to conclude that, so we wouldn't be able to assess that ourselves. As to training, so as you'll understand, London Fire Brigade and the area we serve and the people we protect, there are many complex risks in London. There are different factors and different situations. We try to provide the most up-to-date and professional training for all our firefighters, balanced against the actual risk to life and what we have to do to be able to save lives. So we would prioritise the training that firefighters would need to be able to deal with the highest risks as we see them and as we know them. So this would be a number of different risks. So I would suspect that in any one of my professional departments right across the range of my organisation, there'll be different risks that we become aware of, that we look at and factor whether we provide training on. So, you know, if you look at the risks involving vehicles and hazards from vehicles, so we provide training to firefighters because new technology in vehicles and cars means that firefighters now have to approach cutting a car up in a very different way. That's an absolute risk because firefighters can get injured or killed and we can harm members of the public who are in a car. So it's about balancing what that risk is, balancing the need for training for firefighters, and balancing who is best placed to receive that training. So in this case, we're asking the local authority to assist us to do those inspections, to make sure the premises are safe and to make sure they're fit for purpose for us. It would be, you know, very difficult for us to then be able to go out and make an assessment of all those buildings, and I would find it that we would find it very difficult to train firefighters to be able to make any kind of professional assessment on that, because it would take specifically qualified building engineers and surveyors to be able to do that.
Was it, though, not essential that watch managers responding as incident commanders to a high-rise residential block fire would at least know of the risk of fire spreading across a clad facade?
So I think watch managers were aware of that risk. We do information. We have a thing called a news bulletin, operational news bulletin, where we share information. So there's for me, there's a real big balance about being aware of a risk and knowing what to do when you turn up an incident, responding to that and being able to deal with it. We train our operational officers to be able to respond and to do a risk assessment to whatever is faced in front of them because, as everyone's aware, no two fires are the same, no two buildings respond in the same way, no two vehicle accidents are the same. So we train on basic principles of firefighting, we train on high-rise firefighting, we train on breathing apparatus, and we train our officers to be able to put all those pieces of training together to respond to the detail they find in front of them.
In your last answer, you said you think watch managers were aware of that risk. Can you just help me? What training or information or intelligence specifically identified the risk of spread across clad facades to operational firefighters take the 6 months prior to the Grenfell Tower fire?
So I don't have the detail of that to hand with the training packages that we provide to fire stations. In my position, I wouldn't be expected to know that, what training we're providing to all our firefighters across a range of operational incidents. I can definitely find that information out for you, but I don't know it myself, sorry.
I don't know whether you've been listening to the evidence of the inquiry as closely as I have. I rather doubt it. But I don't think we were able to identify any operational firefighter who attended this incident on the night who was able to stand there underneath it and go, I know what this is. It's a cladding fire. Why is that?
Because I don't think any operational officer would have expected a building to behave in that manner. I know myself, when I turned up on the night, I was absolutely horrified and appalled by what I saw, and I didn't expect that to happen, so I wouldn't have expected any of my officers to give a different answer than that.
Exactly so. And that then takes me to the question. Given their responses and given your own expectation, how do you tally that up with the fact that the risk of fire spread across clad facades was on the LFB's radar by at latest April 2017?
So the fact that it's a risk and a known risk is a difference to how you mitigate that risk and how you respond to that risk. So we knew there was a risk. We're trying to mitigate the risk by asking the responsible people to do the assessments and ensure the risk is not there, because that's their risk. It's those buildings, and the internal response, internal fire safety measures should be in place for those buildings. That's why we wrote out, that's why we responded to that risk and asked the people who are responsible to deal with that risk. When an operational officer turns up to an incident, what I would say is, regardless of whether you were very familiar with the specifics of that, it would not have changed the operational tactics that you would use to respond to a fire travelling on the outside of a building, because you would make best endeavours to put that fire out. Unfortunately, right from the moment that fire left the flat on the 4th floor and started travelling outside the building, there was no way that they could have extinguished that fire. So try as they may, to actually respond and deal with that, it was an impossible situation they were put in. So, although I could turn around and say, yes, we should train for that, there are a number of other risks we train for to keep our firefighters current. What we would seek to do is to prevent the risk happening by asking responsible people to remove the risk for us and for the people involved.
And how confident could you be between April and June 2017 that the responsible people had understood the risk and were going to act so urgently on it that you as the fire brigade could essentially eliminate it from something that firefighters had to consider?
I couldn't be confident of that at all, unfortunately, any more now than I'm confident of the fact that post the Grenfell Tower fire, the responsible people have dealt with all the other buildings that we know are covered in cladding in London.
And in the absence of that confidence, therefore, was it not essential that watch managers receive training on how to spot and deal with cladding fires, and those doing 7.2D visits should familiarise themselves with what they were looking at, so they knew of the risk that they might have to deal with if they attended an incident?
No, I can't say that, because my firefighters would never be able to recognise what cladding was flammable. That's the point for me. Any one of us could not recognise what cladding is flammable, because it shouldn't be flammable. They need to understand the risk of how to extinguish a fire, and that's what we train them for as professional officers, to assess the situation and to put a fire out. And that's what they will do best endeavours to do. And the circumstances of individual different ways of fire travelling, while we try and make them aware, we train them to respond to what they see, to make a risk assessment and to put interventions in place.
But if they don't know what they're seeing, because the risk hasn't been brought to their attention, how can they deal with it?
Because they will deal with what they see and respond. They saw a fire on the outside of a building and they will attempt to extinguish it. Even if they'd known it was a cladding fire, it wouldn't have made any difference to the response of how they were trying to extinguish it. The only means we have available is water. Unfortunately, when you spray water at rainproof cladding, it then becomes very difficult to extinguish a fire.
So do I take it from all of what you've been telling me over the last 5 minutes, that although the risk was on the LFB's radar, it was brought to the attention of local authorities, but the London Fire Brigade didn't itself adopt or adapt any of its own training or information in order to be able to alert firefighters to the particular risk.
No, we didn't that time.
Now, can I then ask you, please, to turn to a different document, which is the London Safety Plan, LFB 50225. There it is. And this is dated March 2017. Can I ask you, please, to go to page 26 of that? And on that page, you'll see in the right-hand column, there are two columns, right-hand column, a heading, Understanding Complex Buildings. And in the third line, if we could just have that blown up, it says, the brigade needs to understand construction methods and possible failure mechanisms and to influence improvements in building design and associated fire safety measures. The design of a building and its layout can have a direct impact on firefighter safety and effectiveness, and the brigade will continue to work with industry bodies and sit on technical standards committees to gather data and promote firefighter safety as a key consideration in future developments. Of course, the focus there is firefighter safety, but the questions are intended to be more general than that. For the purposes of carrying out the purpose of understanding construction methods and possible failure mechanisms, what plans did the LFB have in place between March 2017 and June 2017 to ensure that firefighters at all levels understood construction methods and possible failure mechanisms as referred to here?
So we had no specific plans during that time. It was just part of ongoing training. This would relate specifically to the fire engineering, regulatory fire safety departments working in conjunction with industry bodies.
Right. Does it follow from that that for the purposes of the 2017 London Safety Plan, the LFB had no plans in place to ensure that firefighters at all levels understood the risks posed by fires in cladding on the exterior of high-rise residential blocks?
I would say that this was very early on, obviously March 17, it was when the London Safety Plan was first released. It's a plan that extends over a number of years, so the contents of this plan would be something that would be addressed over the following years and currently now as well. So ongoing training for firefighters in all aspects of firefighting, responding to fires, and developing plans for that will be part of the ongoing training throughout this period of time of the lifetime of the London Safety Plan. So as of March, April 2017, there was probably no specific training in place, but it would be something that would be picked up throughout the lifetime of that. But specifically in relation to recognising cladding, as I said earlier on, that wouldn't be something that we would develop a specific training package for. It would be as relation to a number of measures. So just that's talking about firefighter safety first. So for instance, referring back to the Lackland House fire, that was very key about building failure and the safety to firefighters, because that actually meant that there was a massive open space that our firefighters could fall through on a very high floor level that could result in a loss of life. So it's looking at those kind of aspects in relation to firefighter safety.
Is there now training to understand construction methods and possible failure mechanisms?
No, but it was something that will be worked on as part of, so obviously directly as a result of the terrible events of the Grenfell Tower fire, one of the first things I did was to implement a team to look at the events of the night, to seek to identify any areas that we can make improvements in, to look at areas and understand what happened on that night. And as a result of that, when we fully understand what happened, as soon as we do that, we will then put steps in place to address those issues. And training will be one of those issues we'll be addressing.
We've been through overseas fires, we've looked at the tall building fire spread, we've looked at the March letter, we've looked at the London Fire Safety Plan. As at June 2017, Commissioner, how would you summarise the LFB's understanding of the risks posed by cladding on high-rise buildings?
I would summarise that my fire safety department were obviously aware of the risks from the Shepherd Court fire, which is why they contacted local authorities in order to ask them to address the issues around cladding and fire safety in buildings. So the professional standards people who were the ones dealing with the local authorities were very aware of those. But if you're asking about the detail and the level of firefighters specifically known about it, no, they weren't aware of that. But I truly don't think it would have benefited anyone to have had any more detailed knowledge about cladding to respond to the fire at Grenfell, because it wouldn't have enabled them to extinguish the fire.
Some people might say that that information was kept to the suits and not disseminated to the helmets. Is that fair?
No, I don't think that's a fair accusation. I think there's large numbers of detailed professional advice that stays amongst professional officers. If we tried to impart all the detail around fire safety regulation to our firefighters, we would never be able to train them in the basics of breathing apparatus, hose and ladder training, because there's so much technical detailed information involved in such a highly specialist subject. That's a reason we have a specialist dedicated team for it.
Now, can I ask you to look at page 33 of your statement in light of that answer, please? And we were on it before, under the heading, My Knowledge of the Initial Fire and Our Response to It. You say in the second main paragraph on that page, it was a very severely developing fire, you see. Mm-hmm. And you say, Commissioner, you say that it was consuming the outside of the building. It would have been very difficult for any fire officer standing on the incident ground to have understood what was happening to the building, because buildings don't behave like that. And we never see that type of fire spread. It isn't, on what we've been discussing this morning, isn't it the reality that by June 2017, the LFB had institutional knowledge of the risk presented by cladding, the potential for lateral and vertical fire spread, and the potential for re-entry and mass breach of compartmentation in a high-rise block?
I would say that we obviously had the knowledge about external cladding, fire spread laterally, but I don't think anyone would have anticipated the level of compartmentational breach and complete failure of all the safety systems within a building. No, I don't think we had that knowledge at that time.
Now, on that, even if an incident, you say the level, so you mean scale?
Yes, scale, so across such a number of floors and with such speed.
But is it right, though, that even if an incident on the scale, or level, as you put it, at Grenfell was unrealistic before June 2017, isn't it right that a significant incident caused by the risks we've been discussing was not unrealistic?
I would say with hindsight now, no, it isn't unrealistic. At the time, it would have seemed unrealistic.
No, Commissioner, with foresight.
With foresight, but equally, you know, on the buildings where it's happened, it hasn't caused the spectacular catastrophic failures that we saw on the night of Grenfell. So I don't feel that that would have been a realistic expectation of what would happen. You know, it's really, standing here answering those questions, it's very difficult, because I would love to have had the foresight, I would love to have had the ability and the knowledge, but even if we'd had that, we wouldn't have been able to extinguish the fire. So it's very difficult to stand here and say to you, yes, we could have done this and that, because it wouldn't have made a difference to the response on the night. And that's the point that I feel is really important, that the building behaving the way it did, failing the way it did, causing the rapid fire spread the way it did, even had we known about the cladding, the potential for that, we wouldn't have still been able to extinguish it.
See, what I'm seeking to get at through these questions is the state of the brigade's knowledge of risk. Now, I understand what you say about scale or level. I understand that. What I'm seeking to explore with you, on the basis of everything we've seen so far, and I have to put it to you, is that as at the night of that fire, there was sufficient institutional knowledge within the brigade to know that the risks which had been on that radar, the risks of external fire spread across a clad exterior, were sufficient to make it clear that those risks existed and could cause trouble.
Yes.
Now, at what point in the development of those risk indicators, as they built from 2012 through to April 2017, at what point, can you tell us, does knowledge of a risk acquire a sufficiently critical mass as to require to be trained to operational firefighting crews?
So from my point of view, that would equate to risk and probability. So, you know, there's always a risk of something happening, but the probability and likelihood of it happening, and the likelihood and severity of it happening, all the things you factor into, you know, how you deal with the situation, due to the ever-increasing levels of challenge that organisations like London Fire Brigade face in responding to different risks. The risks we priority are risks to life, quite rightly, because that's our main function, is to save life. Our main loss of life happens in domestic fires. It happens to at-risk and vulnerable people. So we prioritise our training, our resources and our community safety work to tackle that risk and to prevent fires happening in the first place and to educate the public. So we will always focus on the greatest life risk. So whilst we have technical knowledge of situations like cladding fires, we have to balance that against the risk of the likelihood of it happening and the scale of it. Unfortunately, we did not foresee the scale of what was going to happen on that night.
You couldn't foresee the scale, but you could foresee, I would suggest to you, the eventuation of the risk that had been clearly identified over a number of years and was emerging within the LFB's institutional consciousness, couldn't you?
I'd say you could see the risk of a cladding fire spreading outside the building. I don't think we could have seen the risk of the full-scale building failure that happened.
Well, and did you discount the risk of a significant incident caused by external fire spread over a clad exterior? Did you discount that as something which wouldn't cause a threat to life?
So, unfortunately, at the time I wasn't the Commissioner. I wasn't responsible for fire safety and the regulation of that in the job I did previously. So I was not the one accounting or discounting that risk at that time.
From January 2017 then, same question.
For the 6 months then? No, it wasn't something that was given to me as a risk that was likely to cause large-scale loss of life, no.
Can I turn to a different topic, Commissioner, which is FSG calls? Are you all right to carry on?
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, have you personally ever trained for large-scale high-rise block incidents involving multiple FSG calls?
No, sorry, could you, not being difficult, what would you call multiple?
More than one.
More than one. So the nature of fast survival guidance is we train to anticipate maybe 2 or 3. I've never done training on any more than that, no.
Right. Have you ever had personal professional experience of incidents with what I call multiple FSGs, so more than one?
No, I haven't.
Right. I think you've answered my next question, which was what was the highest number of fire survival guidance calls that you've ever experienced at an incident?
Prior to Grenfell, I've never been at an operational incident with fire survival guidance calls.
Never?
Never.
To what extent were you involved in the consideration of development of well, let me ask you this. Are you familiar with Policy 790, Fire Survival Guidance
I'm familiar
calls?
with it, yes.
Yes. And to what extent were you involved in the consideration of the development of that policy on the handling of FSG calls following the Lacanau house fire?
Not at all.
Not at all. Right. Now, we've had some evidence from a watch manager, Peter Johnson. Do you know Peter Johnson?
I know him. I don't know him well. I've met him on a couple of occasions.
And he gave evidence to the inquiry on day 36. And just for our own references, it's at page 204, lines 7 to 12. And he said this: we were not forward-thinking enough and we weren't able to anticipate that we could have multiple calls, multiple FSGs, greater than what was provided for within the policy, which was greater than provided within the casualty information sheets alone, which I think in total was 7. Mm-hmm. Would you agree with that assessment?
That we weren't prepared and trained?
Not forward-thinking enough and weren't able to anticipate that you could have multiple calls greater than provided within the policy?
I find that hard to say weren't forward-thinking enough. I think that the experience we'd had and the developments we've made since Lacanau, obviously resulting in the Forward Information Board and the ability to record that information, I wouldn't say it's forward-thinking, but I don't think we anticipated as well as we could have done that we could have had very large-scale fire survival guidance.
Were you aware of a pilot exercise developed by Watch Manager Peter Johnson, who was a command unit team officer, which demonstrated the operational difficulties that crews would run into the moment they had more than 7 FSGs?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Or even 7 FSGs?
No, I wasn't completely unaware of that, sorry.
He told us that even a 7 fire survival guidance call exercise couldn't be coped with. Would you agree with that assessment?
I wouldn't be able to, because I've never been experienced to see that happen or to see that fail, so no, sorry.
Right. Do you know anything about Mr. Johnson's FSG exercises and what happened to them?
No, I'm sorry.
You don't know whether they were deemed unnecessary or irrelevant or...
I was completely unaware that he developed anything of that nature at all.
Okay. He mentioned, I should just tell you this, that it was shelved out of a concern not to step over Babcock's. Just a short question on that. He looked puzzled. What arrangements prior to, during your time as Director of Safety and then later Commissioner, what arrangements existed in the Fire Brigade to monitor and police what Babcocks were delivering to training officers, to officers by way of training?
We have a very robust method of assessing what goes on. There's a difference between a lot of the training we do with Babcock. So ongoing station training where crews undertake training exercises, either small or large groups, with each other, isn't done by Babcocks. That's done internally and is the responsibility of the London Fire Brigade. So ongoing familiarisation training, ongoing work around that is not something that we would give to Babcocks to do. That's something that we would instigate ourselves. So Babcocks do a lot of the initial acquisition training for us and particular skills training, like for instance urban search and rescue training, breathing apparatus where they have the equipment. But we have our own, we expect our own watch managers, station managers to develop training for local crews in relation to local risk. So that's why, sorry, the puzzled look about the Babcock's bit was I wouldn't see that as particularly as Babcock's responsibility.
What is you used an expression I'm not familiar with, initial acquisition training, is that like...
Oh, sorry, so like firefighter training trainees. So when you want to become a firefighter, we teach you the first skills about how to run hose out, wear breathing apparatus, pitch a ladder. That's what we call initial acquisition, so the first time you learn a piece of training.
Right. 72D visits. Commissioner, what is the purpose of a 72D visit?
So it's to familiarise our operational crews with the risks on their ground so that they are aware of the buildings on their ground, they're aware of the water supplies, they're aware of the means of access, layout of buildings, what hazards might be in a building, where they'd park on the initial attendance, a whole range of things to allow them to be familiar. So it's something they do across a range of buildings, not just in relation to high-rise, so they do it in relation to industrial premises on their ground, schools, swimming pools, anything where there's a risk that they need to be familiar with.
Can I ask you to look at Policy 633 again? We looked at this before, and turn, please, to Appendix 1 in that policy. It's there on screen. Let's just look at that list, and before I do, read with me the opening words of the paragraph. During 72D visits, personnel should ensure that they are familiar with the following and their impact on firefighting and search and rescue operations. And then there is a very long list of matters, including firefighting shafts, lifts, the likelihood of impact of fire spread beyond the compartment of origin, potential for multiple rescues, occupancy, use profile. We can see that. We can read it out. My question is, would you expect, in relation to a high-rise residential block, that each and every one of these items would be considered on each visit?
No. I think this, it does say should ensure. It's not a complete must. They don't have a tick box for it. Clearly, some of those don't apply to all high-rise buildings, so only some of them apply to each specific high-rise building. But the amount of high-rise buildings and other risk buildings on each fire station's ground means that it would be terribly difficult for every single firefighter to have detailed knowledge of every single item on that list.
But visiting personnel are required to ensure that they're familiar with the following, that's what it says, and their impact on firefighting and search and rescue operations. So in your experience and your professional position as Commissioner, just help us understand in practical terms how that obligation is carried out.
Sorry.
And specifically, do crews go round with that list and tick them off, or do they just look at the things that interest them?
It's not about looking at things that interest you. This is about being professional firefighters and their ability to understand buildings. So, so they, hand on heart, 100%. The last time I did them, they were confined to pen and paper and drawn plan line drawings. I think they have more technology around them now. But the specifics around that, and a lot of this is as a result of previous incidents we've had. There, where we're talking about the difficulties in accessing a building potentially or finding where the water supplies are. So they do look at the majority of those, but I would not be able to say they have an exhaustive list, they tick everyone off and search every one of them out, because the time factor involved in doing that, if you were to take a ground, say somewhere like Tower Hamlets, they've probably got something like 250, 300 high-rise buildings on their ground. If you were to do that list in its exhaustedness, in its complexity, it would probably take you 3 or 4 hours. Unfortunately, our firefighters are very busy with operational incidents, they're busy with training, they're busy with familiarisation. So the things they will definitely specifically look at are the things about how they get in and out, the water supplies, how to plug into dry risers, you know, locations of where they would park an aerial appliance, for instance, which isn't cited on there. So you need to understand that, you know, if you go on frontline fire engines, that you need to leave space for an aerial appliance to park, all those kinds of things. Some of those are very difficult to actually assess on a visit. So looking for a void is quite difficult if you don't know where a void is, for instance, and things like that. So yes, it's a very exhaustive list. But I would not be able to say hand on heart every firefighter that goes to every building will look at every single one of those factors.
How would a firefighting crew going to do a visit at a high-rise residential block, such as Grenfell, doesn't have to be Grenfell, how would that crew go about deciding which items they were going to familiarise themselves with and which not?
So it might be around the fact that they might be very familiar with the building already, having conducted a number of home fire safety visits in the building, or having attended operational incidents in that building previously, which would give them prior knowledge of dry rising main, firefighting shafts, lifts and access to those kind of premises, those kind of factors. So it depends on a number of those, and it depends on each firefighting crew, the risks on their ground, whether they've had a sister block that they visited very recently. So there's a number of different factors that they would bring in to scale if they go to visit them.
Where a building was under refurbishment, for example, and therefore changing, would you expect a visiting crew to identify the items in this list which were relevant to that refurbishment and examine them thoroughly?
So the issue would be about whether they knew about the refurbishment of the building, because we aren't always informed about refurbishments. They could see it. So we ask our firefighters as they go around their daily visits on their fire station ground to be vigilant and look at changes to buildings. So if they were programmed to do a visit at that building and there was refurbishment going on, they would look at what factors the refurbishment was impacting on their ability to fight a fire, to access the building, to access the means of plugging into dry risers and things like that.
Yes, we discussed earlier this morning, Commissioner, things like, and it's just above halfway down, the likelihood and impact of fire spread beyond the compartment of origin, and floor layouts and building construction features. How easy is it for a visiting crew to familiarise themselves with those items and their impact on firefighting and search and rescue operations?
I would say it would be extremely difficult to ask a firefighter to assess the impact of fire spread beyond compartment by looking at the outside of a building.
So what do they have to do?
I think some of the things in that list are incorrect and shouldn't be there. I think they're set up, they're not the correct things that they should necessarily be looking at, because it would be, you wouldn't be looking at a building expecting it to fail. You would look at a building, for instance, and say that on a floor of origin, if there was to be a fire there, what the likelihood would be, you know, how you would get into the central core to be able to rescue people. But, you know, so we know, for instance, during the summertime, there's far greater likelihood of fire spreading up the outside of buildings through open windows, so that crews understand that factor of it. But I think it would be very difficult for any crew to look at a building and look at the likelihood of fire spread beyond the compartment on a normal building.
See, I'm interested in that because we've seen the GRA. I didn't show you the full list.
No.
We've seen the LFB list. Are you saying that, from a practical firefighting frontline perspective, some of those at least are completely impracticable?
I think so, personally. I think that some of this list needs looking at, it needs rewording in a lot of factors. I think that now, knowing what we know about what happened on the 14th of June, that we will go back and revisit a lot of what we look at in relation to that, because I think that some of those are not realistic, and some of the things that we look at need different prioritisation.
If they're not realistic, can you explain how they came to be in both national policy and brigade policy?
No, I'm sorry, I didn't have any involvement in the writing of the national policy.
Did anybody writing the national policy and the brigade, or the brigade policy, actually talk to frontline firefighters about this list and how, in practical terms, it was possible to carry out these familiarisations?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure of that.
And I'm sorry, this sounds like an argument. It's not intended to be. But what doesn't the fact that these points, the need to familiarise ourselves with structural things, compartments spread beyond the compartment of origin, building layout. They're there, aren't they? Because those drafting the policy have worked out that these can't be eliminated as risks and need to be looked at.
Yes, I would agree they need to be looked at, but I would also argue that for my frontline firefighters, that they don't have the technical knowledge or ability to be able to do some of those things. So we can anticipate a building might have a sandwich panel, and we know the risk to firefighters from fire travel in sandwich panels. You know, we know the risk of timber frame construction and buildings under construction because we've seen severe fires in those. So those things are absolutely correct and right. I think some of the others are very difficult for firefighters on the fire ground day in, day out to be able to make a judgment on.
Now, can I move to the ORD, the Operational Risk Database?
Mr. Millett, if we're going to go to a slightly different topic, and if we're going to have another break before
We should.
perhaps this would be a good time.
Yes,
Yeah.
certainly.
Right. We'll have another short break now, Commissioner. Again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence, and we'll resume at 12:10, if
Thanks,
that's all
sir.
right. Would you like to go with the usher then?
Thank you.
Right, 12:10, please. All right, Commissioner, ready to carry on?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Commissioner, thank you for coming back to us. Can I ask you please to be shown the ORD, the Operational Risk Database, for Grenfell Tower, and we are led to believe that this is the ORD entry as it stood as at the night of the fire. It's LFB quadruple 03116, and we have it there on the screen. I'm going to assume, and tell me if this is wrong, that you're familiar with what this document looks like and is supposed to do in general terms.
Yes, I am.
Yeah. Now, if I can ask you please to go to page 4 internally under the rubric Tactical Plan. Tactical Plan. We can see under the heading Operational Contingency Plan, we have plan name, Grenfell Tower, with 2 W's. No number for the plan. Version 1, dated effective from 30th of October 2009, 30th of October 2009. The question is that it?
I believe so.
Is that a normal way of an ORD presenting a tactical plan for a high-rise residential block?
No, it isn't.
What is missing?
A tactical plan, actually detail around what tactics the firefighting crews would employ when dealing with this incident.
Right. So Mike Dowden and his crews, when he attended this incident, if that is all they had, as it appears to be, how would that have hampered their ability to plan and create a strategy to deal with the fire that they were seeing?
Not necessarily. I believe Mike Dowden and his crew were very familiar with Grenfell Tower, having visited for a number of different occasions for both community safety events and previous operational incidents. Therefore, Grenfell Tower in itself, being a high-rise of a fairly regular pattern of high-rise, so central core staircase, firefighting lifts, dry rising main, they would be familiar with those. So the lack of detail around a tactical plan would not necessarily have hampered a professional officer like Mike Dowden's ability to respond to the initial fire on the 4th floor on that night. What
about oncoming officers and appliances other than those from the immediately neighbouring fire station, North Kensington in this case?
So obviously oncoming ones from the nearby area would have been there as part of predetermined attendances to incidents in the tower, but oncoming officers after that don't necessarily rely as heavily on the ORD because they get detailed instruction when they get there from the incident commander about the specifics of the role and nature of the intervention they want them to take. And also I go back to the fact it is a fairly standard pattern high-rise, and therefore you understand that there is a central core staircase, a dry rising main, etc., and all those other things in place in that tower.
It's not ideal, is it, to have essentially no operational contingency plan in your ORD, is it?
No, not at all.
Because that means that when you press the button on your appliance that brings up the mobile data terminal, that is all you get.
Yes.
Which is not of any help to anybody, is it?
No, not at all.
Now, can I then just take you to the LFB's IMP report on the incident, which is LFB 3114, which are the lessons learned. It's the IMP report. And look at the 9th box from the top of the page. I'm sorry, page 2. It's halfway down the page, 1 of 2 under development. You can see that it says the Operational Risk Database, ORD, accessed through mobile data terminals, MDT, did not provide sufficient information on Grenfell Tower, in particular the tactical plan and floor plans. And then there's a comment underneath, review PN 800, consider the training provided to staff in collating and recording key information on the ORD and ensure there is a suitable quality assurance process in place. So, first of all, do you agree with the assessment that the ORD did not provide sufficient information on Grenfell?
Entirely.
Yeah. And we'll come to plans shortly, but the review that's referred to, has that happened?
The review of PN 800 is ongoing at the moment.
Right. And what about training?
Yes, the training will fall out. So we undertake the review first of all to find out the shortfalls and the areas for development, and we then develop the training to address those shortfalls.
You attended the incident, as we know, on the night. Were you aware on the night itself that the ORD essentially had no operational contingency plan for this building?
No, I wasn't.
Did you try to find it?
It's not something I can access. You have to access it via a computer or via a fire engine. And equally, the role I undertake, I would never be in a position to be accessing ORD database information.
That's because you were a monitoring officer?
Just the seniority of my role and the role I undertake across the wider piece of the fire ground. There'd be people who would be accessing that at a far more junior level than me.
Right, we'll come back to that in due course if we may. But I think the answer to my question is no. Were you aware, going to the night itself, of any attempts over the course of that night to obtain plans for this building?
Yes, I was.
Right. Just sticking with this document, if we may, Paul, just turn on 2 pages, 3 pages, I'm sorry, to plans and images. Oh, my fault. Can we go back, I'm sorry, to the ORD, tab 13. Take the IMP off the screen. I'd like to go to page 7 of that document, plans and images. Now, that is all that the ORD had for Grenfell Tower on the night of the fire. It is an aerial view, not very large, of the building vertically downwards and some of the neighbouring buildings. It looks as if it's taken with the east face to the uppermost part of the building. Just in terms of what that shows, would that be sufficient information to enable any attending appliance to know anything about this building?
No, not at all.
No. And it's woefully inadequate, really.
Indeed.
Now, on the subject of plans, did you know that, as he told us, Andy Rowe, as incident commander, had been seeking plans for a long time during that night?
Yes, I was present on several occasions when he asked for the plans.
Would you expect plans to be part of the ORD so that they could be immediately accessible by attending crews?
To a certain extent, yes, but the level of detail of the plans that we wanted and we were seeking the local authority, not necessarily.
But you'd expect at least something to be available on the ORD, would you?
I would expect something, absolutely.
Right. Now, did you know that there was no premises information box, so far as we've been able to establish?
I wasn't aware early on the night. It was subject for conversation later.
Right. There was no EPIP either. Do you know what an EPIP is?
I do know what an EPIP is, yes. There was no EPIP.
Electronic Premises Information
Plate.
No. Did you know that on the night?
No, I just was unaware
Right.
on the night.
Now, can I ask you please to go to the London Safety Plan, LFB 50225, and look at page 27. High rise. This is the left-hand column of that page, and I'll just show it to you. From previous consultations, London Fire Brigade also knows that some people may still feel vulnerable from fires in high-rise buildings. The Brigade understands this concern, and that is why it is one of the key concerns captured in the Assessment of Risk Toolkit. The London Fire Brigade would like to reassure Londoners that it has effective measures in place for dealing with incidents in high-rise buildings, and this includes a predetermined attendance of 4 fire engines to any high-rise incident. The Brigade has also developed premises information plates for residential high-rise buildings which provide vital information about layout, dimensions, dry riser outlets, hydrant locations, and whether the building has any lifts. These are available electronically to crews, enabling firefighters to familiarise themselves with the building while en route and to get to work quickly on arrival. Given the absence of the detail that we've seen in the operational risk database for Grenfell Tower and the absence of plans, any plans on those premises, do you consider that in the case of Grenfell, the residents of Grenfell were justifiably reassured by this reassurance?
I would say probably not, because obviously there was no EPIP in place and there were no plans. However, what they could be reassured by was that the crews at North Kensington on the night were very familiar with the building and knew the layout, knew where the dry rising mains were, knew where the firefighting lifts were. So on the night itself, they provided the very best response in relation to knowing all those factors. But the actual absence of that would not provide reassurance to me if I lived in that block.
No. And was it not the brigade's responsibility to ensure, having given that general assurance, that Grenfell Tower had the vital information about layout, dimensions, etc., available to the crews first attending?
Absolutely.
So that was a major failure, was it not?
Not a major failure, no. I would say it was a failure of procedure. We should have had them there, but it wasn't a major failure in the fact it had no impact on the crew's ability to be able to respond operationally on the night.
You don't think?
I don't think, in fact, I know, because I know how familiar the crews were with Grenfell Tower and with the layout and where exactly all the facilities were.
Can you, I don't know whether you're familiar with the evidence that came out yesterday, which Assistant Commissioner Andy Rowe gave about a conversation he'd had around 7:30 a.m. where he'd been explaining that the absence of plans was a major deficiency which would be highlighted. Would you agree with his assessment?
I would say the inability of us to be able to get plans to know the internal floors and the number of flats on each floor was problematic on the night, definitely.
Yes, a major deficiency,
Those were the
Commissioner.
words. Yes, that's the words Andy used.
And I'm suggesting to you that it's a major deficiency for which the London Fire Brigade was ultimately responsible. Do you accept that?
No, I don't, because it's the time at which we wanted that, the time, the information and the layout, we would not necessarily always have that detail either on an EPIP or on plans on the ORD of the specifics of the details we wanted on the night, of the numbers of flats inside. And also what we were seeking to try and get from the local authority was an idea about the residents who were inside those flats, which is knowledge that frontline firefighters would never be able to access.
Well, let's just take it slightly more slowly then. Going back to the reassurance which the LFB felt fit to give Londoners in this document, 2017, before the fire, the reassurance is that that's the brigade, has effective measures in place. And as part of that, it goes on to say, has also developed premises information plates for residential high-rise buildings. Now, would you expect that in order to be able to make good on that assurance, familiarisation visits conducted by crews would make sure that there were premises information plates, or at least some means of immediately accessing the information set out there?
That's what I would expect, yes.
Yes. And therefore, if crews doing familiarisation visits did not check that the premises had those premises information plates and all the details set out there, that would be a serious failure.
I wouldn't call it a serious failure, I would call it a failure. Because it didn't impact on the ability to respond on the night and to deal with the situation they were faced with, because they were familiar with all of the things they were required to be, that information would have given them. So although it was a failure, the fact it wasn't on there, I wouldn't consider it to be a serious failure, and I don't think it impacted on our ability on the night to do our very best to respond to a terrible situation that we should never have been placed in.
So do you agree or disagree with Andy Rowe's assessment that the absence of plans, however detailed, was a major deficiency?
So I agree, because the detail was what we were after, the detail of plans and who was living in those flats, to give us an idea of the people that were missing. So the idea of the plans was us to be able to cross-reference that against knowing who was in there, which is something that would never be contained on the ORD or on NEPIP.
So you say it was a failure but not a serious failure, the absence of plans. Is that?
The absence of this plan, the situation here described here, was not a serious failure. The absence of the plans and the ability of the local authority to supply us the information on the night was a serious problem.
Surely it would have been essential for any crew arriving, certainly early on in the incident, to be able to know how many flats there were on each floor and how many floors there were in the building containing residents. Is that not right?
But they were able to access that information. There was a plate on the outside of the building that said how many floors there were in there, I believe. And also they were familiar with the layout, so they knew the flats on the floors.
Right. I think what this discussion has perhaps thrown up is that you're saying that it didn't matter anyway. Is that?
I'm saying that the lack of the ORD database information and the lack of an EPIP on the night of the Grenfell Tower fire did not impact on the first firefighting crew's ability to respond to the fire, because they already had prior knowledge of the building. The lack of us having the detailed plans and knowledge of the residents inside caused us significant problems.
You say they had prior knowledge of the building. How could any resident living in Grenfell Tower be confident, given this blanket assurance, that the crews who attended would happen to have intimate knowledge or any knowledge of the layout of the building, unless there was a premises information box available to any crew who attended?
I'm not saying the local residents can be confident of that. I'm saying I'm confident the response of my firefighters on the night was not hampered by the lack of that.
Very well. In your role as Commissioner, were you familiar with the Brigade's obligations under the Civil Contingencies Act 2004?
Yes, I am.
You are. And the Civil Contingencies Act 2004 Contingency Planning Regulations?
I am, yes.
You are. You've had briefings and training on that, have you?
Not specific briefings and trainings, but I'm aware.
Were you aware of the Brigade's obligation to maintain a community risk register?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. And that's a register which gets shared with other agencies, is it?
Yes, it is.
Do you know whether the Brigade kept such a risk register?
We have a community risk register that's managed by one of the teams in it. I'm not aware of the detail in it, no.
Right. Do you happen to know whether it was an identical document or database to the PRA, the Premises Risk Assessment, which is also kept?
No, I'm not aware of that.
You don't know whether it's the same or different or contains the
sorry.
same information?
No.
Do you... Right. If... Well, okay. If, as far as Grenfell was concerned, the Community Risk Register carried the same information as the ORD that we've seen, would you accept that it was similarly deficient in the ways we've discussed?
I'm really sorry, I can't comment because I don't know what was in there.
Let's turn to your attendance at the night of the fire. Now, so that we can understand the chronology, Commissioner, you were present as the you were duty brigade manager on the night of the fire.
I was, yes.
Yeah. And that would mean that you would be mobilised the moment there were, is this right, more than 15 pumps?
That's correct.
Right. So that means, is this right, that at 16 pumps and above, an AC, Assistant Commissioner, takes command?
That's correct.
And then your job as duty brigade manager is to be the monitoring officer?
That's right.
Right. Now, can I ask you to go to your witness statement, please, at page 5? You say in the last paragraph on that page that you were made aware of the incident at Grenfell Tower as a result of a phone call from my then staff officer Keeley Foster. This was at 02:03 hours. Where did you source that time from, do you think?
From my telephone log.
From your telephone log, I see. And do you know why you weren't notified at 15 pumps?
I believe the situation on the night, because it was so dynamic and that the control room was so very busy, I believe there was a potential delay in the notification of the staff officers. So I myself, at that time, didn't carry a pager. We get notified by a staff officer who collects details and information and then phones us and tells us the information. So at that time, I had to wait for the call from a staff officer before I was made aware. But I believe it's because of how busy control were that information wasn't relayed at the immediate time.
Did you know how soon after 1:27, when pumps were made 15, did you know that pumps had been made 15?
02:03.
Right. And I think you left home at 02:08.
I did.
And what's the source of that time?
The source of that time was I checked my phone, and when I actually left, I think I got a phone call incoming from Staff Officer Rob Davis, who gave me the postcode for Grenfell Tower as I was about to pull off my drive.
I see. So you took the call?
Yes, I didn't have the postcode at the time, so I needed to know where I was going.
Right. Okay, now you then say that you arrived, this is page 8 of your statement, forgive me. Page 8 of your statement, you say that you arrived at 2:49. That's at the very bottom of the page. Is that right?
Yes.
And do you know the time source for that?
Yes, I was on the telephone to one of my deputies, Tom George. I also booked in with mobilising control via the airwave radio.
Okay.
And then took a photograph, all within the space of 2 minutes.
Right. Now we'll look at the photograph that that's exhibited to your statement. How did you know the time of that photograph? You've timed it at 2:51, I think, but how do you know that?
Because it's time-stamped on my telephone.
Right. Now, can I examine with you your route, very briefly? On page 7 of your statement, you say that as you were travelling to the tower, you heard multiple FSG calls. It's the top of page 7. You see that?
I do, yes.
Did you hear the volume and intensity of FSG calls?
I heard numerous relays of information from control to the fire ground saying they had fire survival guidance and giving details of people and flats.
Did you pick up any specific details about the location of the fire or smoke in the building?
No, so I picked up the detail of the fact people saying they were unable to leave their flats due to smoke in the communal areas and they couldn't get out and they were trapped. I didn't pick up any details around floor numbers. I'm trying to balance listening to the radio to give me some situational awareness with driving on blue lights the incident, which is quite a risky occupation in the middle of the night driving through London.
Yeah, okay. And did you have any thoughts at that stage about what strategy should be adopted in light of that volume and intensity of FSG calls that you could hear?
No, because I wasn't aware of the strategy that was taking place on the fire ground, so I wouldn't seek to preempt what was going on until I could get a view of the building and an actual understanding of what the crews were doing at that time.
You've described, I think, in colourful language.
Sorry.
No, it has the flush of reality about it. But you've described in colourful language what your thoughts were. Did you have any specific thoughts about whether there should be full or at least partial evacuation of this building at that time?
No, none whatsoever. I wasn't familiar with the building, the layout, the number of staircases and means of escape, so no, I wouldn't have thought about that.
Did you have any suspicion at all as to what was happening?
All I knew, it was a terribly significant incident. The speed of escalation of the make-ups and requirement to additional fire engines based against what I could hear with fire survivor guidance led me to believe it was a very significant incident taking place.
And did this have any bearing on anything? Did this have any bearing on anything you'd ever experienced in your career?
Nothing. I've never experienced anything even remotely like it.
Right. Now, you were going there, is this right, to take on the role of monitoring officer?
That's correct.
Can I ask you to look at policy 424, which is LFB quintuple 0531, which, for those who have it, is tab 16 of our policies bundle. There it is, monitoring officer, policy 424, issued in March 2006 and reviewed as current as at the 18th of November 2014. Are you familiar, at least in general terms, with this policy?
I am, yes.
Right. Have you ever had training on this policy or any guidance from somebody as to how it works?
Yes, as part of overall senior manager incident command training.
Right.
We're trained in the role of monitoring officer. Okay,
now can I then ask you some questions about it? If you go to the second page of the policy, there's a key point summary, and although it's not a very long policy, so the key point summary is almost as long as the policy itself. But looking at the duties of a monitoring officer, first bullet point is to undertake remote monitoring of an incident. What would that involve?
So that would be, for instance, if I had been informed of the fire when it was between 12 and 15 pumps, then I would have been able to be in the situation where I could switch on the radio and listen. I could potentially fire up my laptop, have a look at the details of the call, have a look at the building that was concerned, plan my route there if I was going to have to attend. So the remote monitoring officer is an additional layer where you're not attending the incident, but you're looking at the sort of strategic overview and actually in relation to what else is happening in London Fire Brigade. So if I was remotely monitoring that, I'd be interested to see whether we had any other large-scale operational incidents taking part and that sort of thing.
And how did you perform that function on the night, remotely?
I didn't at any point because the first time I was made aware the fire was of such a significance that I wanted to attend immediately.
Right. And then in the third bullet point, gather evidence of operational performance. This is to include observations on behaviour, attitude and other relevant interactions. Is that gathering of evidence something that starts only once you've reached the incident ground, or is it something that starts as soon as you're alerted to the incident as a monitoring officer?
So it can start when you're alerted to the incident, because you can be listening to the messages that are being passed from the fire ground, and that would give you an indication of what's taking place. It would also give you an indication of the quality of the messages that are being relayed. So, for instance, if the messages are very short and there's an urgency, you can get some sort of feeling of what's happening on the fire ground, but the vast majority of that takes place face-to-face on the actual incident ground.
Right. During your journey, about to take over the monitoring officer role, did you have your airwave radio on? I'm assuming you did.
I did, yes.
And you could hear all the radio traffic coming from from control to the incident ground.
So you can't hear all of it because for large portions of the incident you're driving under sirens, which actually pretty much exclude you hearing anything else other than the sirens in your car. So you can only hear parts of it when you're not operating your two-tone sirens.
Right. That's not terribly helpful, is it? And which would be more important?
Two-tone sirens, so people don't kill me.
Right.
Otherwise, I'll never get there.
Right.
So unless I alert other road users to my presence, they won't let me through. I won't get there. Or worst case scenario, have an accident.
Okay. I mean, did you hear any of the make-ups or any of the messages relating to FRUs, or did you hear, for instance, there was a major incident declared?
No, I didn't hear that. I was aware it was a make pumps 40 before I left home.
Right.
So that gave me all I needed to know about the scale of the incident, to be fair.
Okay. As you left home, did you know who was incident commander?
No, I didn't.
You didn't?
No.
Did you want to find out?
No, not particularly. I just wanted to get there. It would have. So the fact that whoever was incident commander, I couldn't influence that. There was nothing I could do about it. I knew that on a make pumps 40 there'd be a significant number of senior officers attending the incident. So at that moment in time, it was of no use to me to know that.
Hearing the intensity and the volume of the FSG calls so far as you could, given the sirens, did you make any attempt to call the control room?
No. I'd already got a very clear indication from my staff officer, Keely Foster, that the control room were under severe pressure and were handling a large number of fire survivor guidance calls. Me calling in and interrupting them would have been no help whatsoever.
Right. Well, we'll come back to the gathering of evidence in a moment when we look at the policy and what you did. The next item is take command of an incident, either if required or as necessary. In what circumstances would you, as the monitoring officer, decide to take command of an incident?
So the rank I am now, never. I've never taken command as the principal officer, so I'm effectively the top level of officer that will ever attend the fire ground. This monitoring officer policy covers all ranks from the rank of station manager upwards. So, for instance, a station manager will go out and monitor a 4-pump fire. They may well take over if it's an inexperienced watch manager. Vice versa, a deputy assistant commissioner could go out and take over from a group manager, either if the incident escalated or if they felt it needed a greater span of control.
Right. Just to unpack that a little bit, I know you were commissioner from the 14th, officially from the 14th of June, by coincidence, I think. But in the period, the 6-month period prior to that, when you'd taken on the essentially acting role of commissioner, had you any experience of taking command as a monitoring officer? No,
so I've never, in the role I'm now, so I sit on the same level operationally as my 2 deputies. The 3 of us are considered the principal officers for the fire ground, and neither as a deputy commissioner or as a commissioner have I ever taken over from an assistant commissioner.
Right. And looking at the 5th bullet point, ensuring a safe system of work, how would you go about discharging that function? So that would mean that, in general or specifically in relation to Grenfell, sorry? Specifically on the night in relation to Grenfell. So on the night, that would require me attending the operational incident, receiving a briefing from the then incident commander, looking at the systems that are in place, potentially having a conversation with the senior safety officer, which I did, and speaking to the ORT officers. And looking at the 6th bullet point, which is the provision of support and guidance to the incident commander, in broad terms, can you explain how you went about discharging that duty on the night? Yeah, so on the night what I did was to make sure that I was available to Andy Rowe, that we could have conversations around key risk critical decisions, around plans, around specifically conversations around things like one of the ones that comes to mind was when we had a conversation, a very clear one on the back of the command unit, about the risk to firefighters and the risk to us continuing to commit firefighters into a very dangerous environment, weighed against the risk of the lives that we believe we could save inside the tower.
And that conversation was a very difficult conversation to have, because we basically discussed the fact we were potentially and quite probably risking the lives of firefighters, and that we were potentially going to lose the life of one of our firefighters to balance against the risk of saving people inside the building. That's not a decision you want to take in isolation, and that's something that, as an incident commander, you absolutely need the support of a monitoring officer to make.
Now, let's examine a bit more closely the ingredients of the role of monitoring set out in this policy. If you go to the third section on the second page of the policy, monitoring, so we're still under key point summary, although I think the rest of it is fairly similar. The second bullet says, let's look at the first bullet as well. The MO is to apply the DMM, that's the decision-making model, which I'm assuming you're familiar with, the risk assessment process to the incident, and compare their conclusions and risk assessments with that of the incident commander. So just pausing there, does that tell us that you as the MO, monitoring officer, have to perform your own independent risk assessment and then look at that and work out whether it's the same as the incident commander?
Yes, but it's generally done in conjunction with the incident commander, because I need the incident commander to tell me what their risk assessment operational plans are and what they're actually doing, because it would be very difficult for me to conduct an independent one without knowing the actions that are taking place. So it's not something you sit and do in isolation. So the conversation around the DMM is something that all our incident commanders do at the point of handover and have a conversation, and we brief against that. It's a very good tool for ascertaining the key information and the process of evaluation.
And is that because you, in order to carry out your own risk assessment process to the incident, need to be given all relevant information by the incident commander who's been there on the ground so far?
Yeah, as much as possible in a time frame, because clearly there's a large volume of information to impart, but the key information about what's happening and the operational plan.
Would you agree that it's necessary in carrying out that role that you do your own independent assessment, bringing your own expertise to bear, rather than simply rubber stamping what the incident commander has done already?
So it's not rubber stamping. So what I'm trying to explain by that is I would have the conversation. So on the night, I had the conversation very clearly with Andy Rowe. I then went out to the fire ground to look at the situation myself and to make my own assessment.
Just sorry, let me put my question again. Do you, so far as you understand this role, it's not a rubber stamping exercise. It does require you to carry out your own independent assessment.
Indeed.
Yes. And it needs to be robust on the basis of what you yourself learn.
Definitely.
Now, under the second bullet point, having ascertained the IC's plan, the intended tactics and communication structure, if appropriate, the MO should tour the incident and evaluate the operational plan and feed back to the IC. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that you would need to go out to each sector and find out what they're doing?
Not specifically, no. It depends on the actual incident that's taking place as to what you do. But on the night of Grenfell, it meant that I wanted to go into the tower to speak to the people, but a lot of that is done with the assistance of the ORT officers who accompany you quite regularly as the monitoring officer, because they can provide you a clear picture of what's been taking place, and you go and get situational awareness yourself to be able to make that judgment. It doesn't necessarily mean visiting every sector.
Does it not?
No.
We'll come to the sectorisation shortly, but would it not be essential in order to review the intended tactics and communication structure that you should go and talk to the heads of the sectors who had been put in place by the incident commander, just to find out, even in general terms, what they were doing?
Yes, and I did that at certain points of the incident. You don't necessarily do it on your first foray into the fire ground, and you rely very heavily on the professionalism of the ORT officers who have done that for you and can brief you with that information.
Yes, I'd understand you'd want to rely on professional assistance of others at the fire ground. I understand that. But just in terms of what you yourself, as monitoring officer, needed to do, whether accompanied or otherwise, you would, I would suggest, need to go to talk to the people in charge of the fire sector or the search and rescue sector, to work out, even in general terms, what they were doing, so that you could carry out the evaluation of the operational plan?
No, not necessarily. My vast experience of operational command and the procedures and policies and the vast amount of times I've undertaken a monitoring officer role, you make an assessment on the scene as to what information you need to gather at that moment in time to make those decisions.
Yes, and one of the sources of the information you need to gather to make those decisions would, I would suggest, be those who were running the operational sectors.
Yes, at a time, which I did. Early on, I didn't visit them, but at a time, yes, at a certain point in time, you'll visit all of them.
Yeah.
But my initial assessment didn't involve me going to the bridgehead on the 4th floor.
No, we'll come to that, Commissioner. We will come to what you actually did. At the moment, just trying to get a feel for what the obligations are and how you go about doing the job you were doing. Can I just move on then in this document to page 3, monitoring, which is paragraph 4. It's entitled Monitoring, and paragraph 4.1 says, the process of monitoring is the measurement of the efficiency, effectiveness, and where possible, economic performance of individuals and the organisation at incidents and simulations. It's carried out in 2 distinct ways, either remote from or directly by attending the incident. Would you agree that that is the substance of the monitoring officer's role?
Definitely.
Looking at the substance of that role as set out there, would you agree that you would need to have some grasp of the detail of what was going on the fire ground in all its different sectors to be able to measure the efficiency, effectiveness, and if we need to get into it, the economic performance of the individuals involved?
Yes.
Can I then take you to your witness statement, page 9, where you say, in the 4th paragraph down, it's the last paragraph, in fact, on the page, I was aware that I needed to find the incident commander. As monitoring officer, my role is to provide some reassurance, guidance, and support. Is that the complete description of your role?
No, but that was the thrust of the first things I would need to do in relation to recognising the significance and the extraordinary events of Grenfell Tower, was that whoever it was in charge was going to need some serious reassurance, guidance and support at that moment in time. Obviously, clearly the content of the monitoring officer policy is what the entire role is, but that was my first priority.
I understand that. I understand that you want, as a responsible commissioner, to, as it were, deploy your soft skills. But I just want to make sure that we're all clear that was not the totality of it, and that
No,
there were some hard calculations to be done as well.
Absolutely.
Right. Now, did you do the monitoring officer role throughout the night?
I did, yes. But as I explained in my statement, at a certain point in time, the role changed because due to the significance of the incident, you'll appreciate there were a large number of external factors that I needed to deal with. So for the point where, up to and including probably, I can't say what time, it was about 9:30, I was very heavily involved and close to Andy. From that time onwards, although I was in close contact with him, there were a number of other things I had to deal with, press, talking to the Mayor of London and various other things that are also, in my role as Commissioner, absolutely key.
I see. So does that mean that, in fact, there were parts of the night when you weren't doing your monitoring officer role?
I was still doing the monitoring officer role, but I was doing other things in addition to it as well.
Okay. Can I just show you the PRC notes, which we have? These are LFB 3112. And just to set this in some context for you, these are handwritten notes taken at a meeting of the 24th of July 2017, the PRC meeting,
Yep,
which I think you attended.
I was, yes.
And I don't know whether you've seen these notes since or after that meeting.
No, so these would have been made by Deputy Commissioner Tom George, who was chairing the meeting, and probably should have a second occupation as a doctor because they're terribly difficult to read. But
well, it's okay.
Yes.
Yes.
So no, I haven't seen them there at Tom George's notes. I've seen the outcomes of the development and the points that were ended up, but I've not seen these notes.
Yeah. And can I just ask you please to turn to page 17, which I think is the very last page of the document. And 4 lines down from the top, you say, felt not doing monitoring officer role fully due to speaking to crews. Why do you say that?
So just to set the context of where this is, so this, the performance review of command we undertook there took 10 hours 45 minutes. So for 10 hours 45 minutes we'd sat in a room with all the incident commanders in a very short time frame after Grenfell Tower, going through the incident on the night. It was a very difficult meeting. It was a very emotionally charged meeting. We'd had to pause it on a number of occasions where people had broken down and become very distressed. This was the first time a number of people had spoken openly about the events of the night. If you see the point above where it says staff in tears, I'd gone out to the fire ground on a number of occasions, and where normally you'd go out and just make an assessment of the operational plans and tactics, I'd spent a large number of time talking to firefighters who'd broken down in my arms. Firefighters I'd never met before, firefighters I didn't know. I've never seen a situation on the fire ground where firefighters are openly crying and distressed. And I felt at that moment in time that I wasn't 100% performing the monitoring officer role according to the policy, but I felt that was a far more important place. And Andy Rowe assured me that at all times he felt fully supported, and he never at any point felt that I wasn't performing my role. It was my personal reflection as a result of a very emotional situation that I felt I had been involved very closely with some very, very distressed people, and that was my priority at that time. There was absolutely no way I could have had a firefighter burst into tears and just walk away and leave them at that moment.
Yeah. Would it have been helpful for you to have had another senior officer take over, or perhaps share the monitoring officer role with you?
So later on in the incident, my other Deputy Commissioner, Steve Apter, did join me on the incident ground to take away the role of monitoring officer so I could do the outward-facing piece. I did that, yes.
Right. What time was that?
I'm really sorry, I can't remember. It'll be on the incident log as to what time he arrived.
Would it have been more helpful, though, to have somebody share that role with you earlier so that you could do what you've told us you were doing with crews?
No, because initially I was able to perform the role of monitoring officer very clearly and give Andy the support he needed. This was during daytime, so daylight, so it'd probably come into maybe about 9 o'clock in the morning when I was out doing that.
When you were out not performing the monitoring officer role fully due to speaking to crews?
When I say not performing, that's an emotionally charged statement. I just felt at the time that I was doing something more important, but it wasn't. I was still contactable by Andy Rowe. I had a radio on me. He could still access me if he needed to, and I was fully aware of what the operational plan was, and I was standing very near the base of the tower so I could see the activities that were taking place.
So just so I'm clear in my mind about timing, when you say felt not doing monitoring officer role fully due to speaking to crews, that's later in the incident, is it?
Yeah, so it wouldn't. I did a lot of speaking to crews on the night. It was very essential that I provided some what I perceived to be direct leadership, and the reason for that was that, in my opinion, the situation they were going into was life-threatening to them. I felt that if I, as their commissioner, went into the tower and spoke to them and showed that I was prepared to be in the same situation of risk that they were, it would give them the impetus to feel that they could carry on doing the tasks they were doing. And I've had people subsequently say to me it made a complete difference to them, the fact I was in there and I was prepared to risk my life in the tower to be there and support them. So although you can take the kind of the detail of the monitoring officer role as to how it is specifically, my role in the night was far greater than that. Motivating, supporting and showing my firefighters I was there alongside them was absolutely key.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I think now may be an appropriate moment for a break.
Yes.
I just want to make a trigger warning, if I can. The next thing I'm going to go to, likely the next thing I'm going to go to is a photograph of the tower on fire. It's the photograph you took at 02:51. It's been read into the record, but it's not, I think, available in the room. It is a photograph of the building on fire, and so if people find that disturbing, then they should take steps not to be present during the first 15 minutes after we resume.
Right. Well, I'm sure you're right to mention that now, but I think it would be wise to mention it again after the adjournment, because others may have come who haven't been here to hear you say that.
Yes.
And I think they ought to get a proper warning as well.
Very well, I'll do that.
All right? All right. We're going to stop now so we can all have some lunch, and we'll resume at 2 o'clock. Again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room, and we'll resume then.
Thank you, sir.
Right. If you'd like to go to the usher, she'll look after you. Thank you. 2 o'clock then, please.